Hello, my name is Nicholas. Welcome to my day, as it normally begins and as we explore together. I'm from immigrant roots, Croatian on my dad's side, and Scotch, Dutch, and Polish on mom's. My parents were born and raised in Minnesota, with Dad's first big trip being to Alaska in 1955, dragging a trailer up the Elkhorn Highway. My mom came the next year. Nichelle, my older sister, was born in 1957, and me a year later in 1958. We were territorial citizens. My four other siblings, Thomas, Mark, Stephanie, and Paul, were born here also, but by then it was the state of Alaska. Dad was also Nicholas Begich. Started as a project inspector, teacher, boys counselor, a principal, school administrator, and then superintendent of schools for the military bases here in Anchorage. He was then elected to the state senate twice, and later elected twice to the U.S. House of Representatives, the Congress. At 40 years old, he and U.S. House Majority Leader Hale Boggs were lost on a plane in Alaska and never found. Leaving Mom in 1972 at 34 years old, raising 6 children, the youngest, Paul, was 4. Mom raised 6 overachievers and was accomplished in government in many roles she played here. I grew up in Anchorage, and as a child remember being immersed in experiences that took my family around the United States and Canada in epic summer road trips with Mom and my brothers and sisters. Politics, statesmanship, honor, honesty, self-examination, loyalty, consideration, respect. People of every kind were the meaningful things embedded in my early part of my life. I went on to have a lifetime of experiences that were great. I've enjoyed work in business, mining, science, education, Native American leadership roles, construction, publishing, writing, lecturing, and scholarship, among many things that will be discussed throughout the next several hours. These experiences were part of the great adventure my family has lived since we arrived in the United States, beginning in the 1880s on Mom's side and early 1900s on Dad's. I have hundreds of family members around the United States and world. I'm still meeting them at 62 years old, and what I've learned in my family, a big family, is that love trumps all. That love carries us through the difficult times. We are all very different, my family and group of many friends. I also have 6 children of my own, Nicholas 3, Melissa Page, Forrest Falcon, Sierra Rain, Nicole Sapphire, and Aurora Phoenix, and I have 4 grandchildren. We're all radically different in our beliefs about the things and as people and how we express ourselves in the world. However, my brothers and sisters are united in our base values because of our parents. The ideas of freedom, liberty, justice, fairness, compassion, empathy, honesty, self-examination, and, most importantly, love. Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter were always important days and still are now, but now they are the most lively debates in a full spectrum political family, from the left to the right and everything in between. But at the end of the night, we always leave knowing that love is the binding agent of change and respect is the gateway to a new world. Welcome to the Masterclass of the Hidden Monks. Test. Do you have it? Testing 1, 2, 3. Test. Test. Is it working?
Now it's gone.
Oh, come on, guys. Do we got the sound back? On and off?
Okay, now we have it.
Okay.
All right, we back.
All right,
Ready?
quiet. I'm set.
Can I get that just lifted some?
Yeah.
Welcome to the Hidden Monks.
That's already on.
Okay, good.
Perfect. Are we ready?
Yeah, go.
Going live in 3, 2, 1.
All right. You know, a little bit of a break. I guess we hit the the end of the 10-hour reel, and we're going into the second 10 hours really to begin this part. I'm going to switch places in a minute, but I'm going to grab my notes real quick. I left them laying here. A little bit of a rush coming back into the scene today. When we think about all this, we've had a busy morning, busy afternoon. Now we're into the busy evening in my part of the world and the later evening in the rest of the world. But I want to wrap up the privacy and surveillance issues. I want to hit a couple more points, and one I didn't make before. All the cameras are pointed at us right now in every which way. And I talked about the social scoring in China. I talked about the biometrics in India. And now think about this. You know, I've had times when people have asked me for thumbprints to cash checks. I don't like that. I complained about that to the bank that was leaving Alaska, and that was Bank America, because I won't bank with them anymore because of it. And the bank that replaced them was North Rim Bank. And I called them before they took over, and I talked to their managers, and I said, look, if you're going to require this, I'm not only not going to bank with you, I'm going to make a point of it anytime I'm on radio to talk about it. And they did the opposite. They didn't require that, and they still don't. And that's why I bank with them, because they don't need a thumbprint they're never going to use to catch a thief that's never going to be that dumb. You know, and the systems, the way they're set up, why do they need this? It's a false sense of security to gather more data about you and make you feel like, okay, it's okay to give it up. It started at the airport. You know, there was a time when I grew up where you didn't have to show ID to buy a plane ticket. You go in there and say your name is John Smith, they'd sell you a ticket. That's how it worked. You actually dressed up to go take a flight. You know, people didn't show up in their pajamas and go through security. They didn't do any of that. It was a way different deal. And we used to go to the airport. We could even hang out at the restaurant and say goodbye to our friends out the window at the gate. Imagine that. You know, as a kid, I used to be able to walk up the steps of the Capitol in the United States Capitol, you know, that one there in Washington, D.C. And I didn't have to go through security to go in the rotunda, you know, where you can look at all of that and you can whisper on one side and hear it really loud on the other because the acoustics are so perfect. You didn't have to go through security. You didn't have to do that until you got to the gallery of the U.S. House or Senate where they had security, because some idiot during the Cuban days of hassles going on in Cuba, you know, wanted to machine gun a bunch of senators. But it was relatively open. You know, you could walk into buildings and you could be in your Capitol, and we can't anymore. In fact, right now, as I'm making this film, you can't go there. Lobbyists can't even go there, which is kind of a good thing, but you know, not for the rest of us. You can't get on Capitol Hill in a congressional office today in America. My son just came back from 3 weeks in Washington, D.C. on the Capitol, but to be there, he had to be an intern at 43 years old. He's an intern. He has a baby face. He could pass for 20. But he's there looking at that situation, learning about government from the inside for things he's thinking about in the future. You know, should he run? Should he be the next Nick Begich in Congress? Maybe he will be. He's making that decision. I've tried to talk to the desk in his office if they'll let me. But otherwise, I'm not going to see him like I did. I'm going to give him up so you guys can have his service if that's what he decides to do. And when he makes the decision, whichever way it is, I'm going to be there with him. If he says, no, I'm not doing it, Dad, I'm going to continue to run the 60 companies I've helped build. Or he's going to say, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give up all that. Whatever he decides, I'm there with him. But I know he in the 21st century is technology. And we don't have educated people in the Congress that can go into closed hearings where their staff isn't allowed, they cannot make notes, and they cannot discuss what they hear there with anyone. And then they get the dog and pony show from whoever's presenting, the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, whoever it is, and there's no one there with enough science knowledge to ask the kind of questions that I asked Reho Michaela when I was 19, that I mentioned in a lecture hours and hours ago. Because he doesn't have the brains in the Congress. People don't have the brains in the Congress, not because they're not smart people. They lack that body of knowledge to challenge the body of knowledge being presented. So when technology decides everything about whether a constitution is real, you have to have people who know enough to ask the right questions and insist on honest answers. And we don't have that. And we don't have whistleblower mechanisms that protect the Snowdens of the world so that governments aren't violating us in every single way in our names. And I'm going to jump ahead because it fits better here. Our felonious government just fits better here. And what does our government do in our name? By the people, and for the people, and of the people. They lie to us, right? They've been lying to us about UFOs until the other day, a few months ago. They've been lying to us about everything for a real long time as a plan and a pattern of misinformation, propaganda. I mean, we can go back and look historically of when that happened, usually 50 years after everybody's dead. That's why those old history books are so valuable, because they didn't get altered by the new history and the, oh, maybe we don't want to see it that way anymore. But the truth doesn't change because we change. The truth stays what it is. How we interpret it can change, certainly. But what else does our government do in our name? Well, they dig through people's trash. They do that domestically and internationally to see what's in the garbage so they can blackmail people, you know, or otherwise be able to manipulate people. We also, you know, do things, the CIA did a lot of this, they still do this. In fact, Epstein was probably a big part of this. See, people go, where did he get $500 million? That's a lot of money. Yeah, that's a lot of money, but B-1 bombers, $2 billion, $2,000 million. So $500 million is pretty cheap money. If you can sexually extort, 100 corporate and political leaders from around the world, that might come in handy. That's worth a lot of bombers, if you ask me. But don't ask me. Ask the CIA and the NSA and the rest of them, because this is what they do. Why Hale Boggs was so angry at the FBI when he died with my dad on a plane was because they were bugging his office and all of his colleagues, the FBI under Hoover, checking their mail, tapping their phones, and blackmailing whoever they could for that little worm, that little bureaucrat, to run way too much government. How do you think he made it through Republicans and Democrats and everyone else? Because he had them by the short hairs, you might say, is what was going on there. And he ran too much of our government. And Hale Boggs wanted his butt out and said it on the floor of the Congress that very year on my father's birthday, April 6th. Go look it up. But he was gone. He was gone. Hoover had quit. But the institution was as ugly and corrupt as it ever was, because he built it and the whole leadership of it, all the way down through the ranks, had his stench associated with what they were doing. And there were exceptions, but they had no whistleblowers, except maybe Deep Throat, who managed to get out of the FBI a little information on how corrupt it was going with the Nixon administration and what was happening then. That's when the Pentagon Papers were being released. Who was releasing was Mike Gravel, the senator from Alaska. And the next race, the next one my dad was in, was going to be in the U.S. Senate against him, to get him out of there. These guys were doing things, and things weren't getting disclosed in the right way. Things were falling apart, and what we saw was a tip of the iceberg. We never got the truth, because they just killed them all. Kennedy was the first one talking about the deep state. It wasn't Republicans, it wasn't Trump, it was John F. Kennedy. Look it up. And his brother, Robert, warning about the deep state then, about the corruption Eisenhower warning about the corruption that would come out of the military-industrial complex. I remember in the early 70s hearing my parents talking about the most corrupt people of all were the military-industrial complex. They were handing out bags of money. My dad would be sitting in the congressional restaurant and the Maritime Union setting a stack of money across the table, and my dad and his campaign manager grabbing it and opening it up for everyone to see and saying, "Oh, a campaign contribution from the Maritime Union. It's too bad, not the Maritime, the shipbuilders. Too bad, shipbuilders. He was a union man, but thank you for the contribution," announcing it to all of his colleagues right in the middle of the restaurant. When one guy came in and tried to bribe my dad, he grabbed him by the back of the collar and the seat of the pants, and he wasn't a violent man, but that guy did a little skidding operation down the hallway of the Longworth building. Things were different then, My dad didn't get mad. He didn't even swear. I'm amazed I made it through 10 hours and I haven't done it yet. But I can tell you something about integrity and honesty and commitment. It gets outraged at what my dad was just beginning to see, and he was only there 2 years. He got elected to 2 terms, but he was already dead when he got elected the second time. That's how popular a man he was in this state. He was missing, he was gone. But he won his election by what today would be considered a landslide. And the guy he beat is the guy who ran later again in a special election and has been there for 50 years as the longest serving congressman in U.S. history. And we'll see who goes next. But the point I'm making is history is made by you and me. And I got to see it happen here a little bit. But the government has been working against us in a lot of ways in our name. Extortion and blackmail. Is that who we are? I don't think so. How about theft and breaking and entering? They do that routinely. It's one of the methods. Then they set up their taps. They do roving wiretaps. Just go through neighborhoods and randomly collect data. That's the government we have now. How about sexual blackmail? That's the Epstein pattern, and that's what a lot of governments do. China does it, Russia does it, U.S. does it, they all do it. Hey, that's a good place to exploit people, get them in their sexual deviance. Or just the fact they're married and they're having sex with someone that isn't their wife or their husband. Pretty easy to blackmail and manipulate people. Our government's really good at it. Bribery and corruption, we do that all over the world. In fact, one of my family members was working in Egypt during a set of elections a number of years ago. And one of the revolutionary parties that was involved in that election, if you remember, they got a bunch of NGOs, non-governmental groups. A lot of Americans got, grabbed up and held. Now my brother Mark was in the U.S. Senate at the time, and my brother Tom wasn't. And Tom says, "Hey, Mark, why don't you just tell Obama to cut off the money for all the Egyptian generals? This will get fixed right away." That's what happened, right? In a few days, everybody got loose. Because they bribe all these people. They bring them here for war games and training, and then we pay them off and send it off to the Swiss accounts. All you got to do is cut the cash flow. Hey, everybody gets attentive. But is that right? Now, if you as a businessman try that somewhere in the world, they'll arrest you for bribery and corruption, even though you're not on American soil. But the Constitution doesn't go there. But you do. How does that work? But our government can do the same thing and get away with it, but you can't. But every other government can, and everybody else can that you're competing with worldwide. I could give you examples of how that is, but I won't, because it'll cost too many people their business. Because if I told you what happened in these various countries that we're supposed to have an equal playing field on and we don't, they wouldn't get to work in those countries anymore with their businesses. But they're not paying the bribes, they're just not getting the local business. That's a shame. We're not on an equal playing field in the world, because most governments are openly corrupt and ours is covertly corrupt. So we feel good about it. We don't do bribery anymore, we do campaign contributions. We just give it a new name, gives it a nice feel. Feels good, doesn't it? I've contributed. What? Here we are in Alaska having this conversation. Last U.S. Senate race, I think about $50 million got spent to convince 200,000 voters how to vote. Right. And it wasn't money from here, it was money from somewhere else, because every U.S. senator is worth it. And here we got no population at all. Hey, this is a great investment if you want to own the Senate. You come here and you buy Alaska senators, because they're cheap. You only have to convince a few 100,000 people that you're right. But this is how the game is played by special interests. How many senators do you have? There we are. You know, who writes law? We're going to get into that later. But I want to finish the corruption part, because we haven't gotten through the list of felonies that we're all responsible for. Bribery and corruption, political interference. There's a good one. We're all mad at the Russians. Did they really interfere with our elections? You know, we interfered with every single election everywhere in the world for the last 50 years. Every single one of them, including Brexit with Trump's involvement in that, and Obama's involved with that. Now, if that's not interference, I don't know what is. We're telling another country what to do. We get involved in elections. We get involved in candidates. We do that all the time routinely. And why should we be surprised when it happens here? We shouldn't. We should expect it. And because we should expect it, why the hell weren't we ready for it? Why do we have automated voting in the first place that could be susceptible to any interference, where any one of us should doubt the outcome of an election? We don't do that here. Here we do ink on a ballot. Yeah, it runs through a machine, but if we're not happy with the count, both candidates have an observer looking over the shoulder of every counter, and they're counting those votes by hand. And these machines and those hand counts these days aren't off more than 1 or 2 votes. Ever. Lately. Take a look at the record. But you can go to a record and you can touch it. And you know, you could make it even one better if you just a 2-part ballot with a number attached, so you pulled it apart. Then you could even load the full information up somewhere later and say, hey, did I really vote that way? But automating any of it without keeping the hard copy is a mistake. And don't tell me about blockchain or any other nonsense. If it's in a system, it can be manipulated unless it's on a piece of paper, bound in a book, and real. All right? Make it real, not digital. Make that real, keep that real, or you'll lose your democracy, you'll lose your republic, you'll lose whatever you think you're voting on. And that's what's going on here. Political interference, we do it by design. We make sure these machines can be screwed with, because we want to screw with the other guy's election. If you're listening somewhere else in the world, hey, so what if it takes you 3 months to count the votes? Elections are in November, you swear people in January. You already have 3 months. Take the 3 months, make sure you have confidence in the process. Political interference. How about kidnapping and torture? That made a lot of news a few years ago. Any of you feel like you're a kidnapper and torturer? Well, you all are, so am I, because our government does this in our name. The Epstein world I've already covered. And then I ask you this. Is science and the way we handle this, and is secrecy the right way to handle this? And is that what preserves a republic? Secrecy? Because we've allowed the secrecy syndrome now to expand way, way beyond its boundaries. To basically be the cover your ass program. There's number 1 for swearing today, I guess. All right, but that is it. It's a CYA, man. It's all about that. And let's do it by committee so there's no individual to blame here. And that's what we're seeing play out. Let's make it complicated so no one can figure it out. It doesn't work anymore. We're all pretty angry about it anymore because we feel like it's been taken from us, because it has. Only it's like the boiling frog, you know, you throw them in the pot, turn the temperature up, just wait, and he never hops out, just boils to death. Or the better one was Chuck Harder's example of the salami. You know, 1 slice at a time until the salami's all gone. And that's what our democracy and our republic has been about. 1 slice at a time until the bologna is all gone, actually. And then we're just full of it, right? Because we bought this stuff. And we've accepted it incrementally on the installment plan. And it's happened not overnight. This happened over a few generations. Because it's the only way it could happen. Because there's at least 2 generations usually with our heart beating at the same time. Because we're not dying at 40 anymore. And that's important if you think about it and how it plays out. When I think about the government again, and talking about, and to kind of wrap up the surveillance, it's time to turn the cameras the other direction. Every government office, state, local, municipal, federal, unless you're dealing with somebody's health care or something that truly is confidential, like an ongoing lawsuit or something, hey, we need to point those cameras the other direction. We need to see what our employees are doing throughout government. Every classroom in America should have a camera in there that every parent should be able to see what their kid is doing, and not every pervert, but every parent. And how come? Because then you can see if the teacher's doing their job, or if little Johnny is screwing off, and you can deal with that at home, because teachers won't. But parents will. How about running that in the background instead of entertainment when you're at work? What's Johnny doing at school? Is the teacher doing their job? And hey, teacher, if you're too uncomfortable with that, you don't like the scrutiny of the public, then don't be a public employee. Go work somewhere else. Go do something else. If that's too big of an invasion on your personal privacy, when you're taking the responsibility of programming our children, you get to pull your pants down in public as a teacher and expose yourself to whatever you're teaching. Because if you can't expose yourself to whatever you're teaching, then maybe you're teaching something that either you can't tolerate or shouldn't be tolerating too. And I would challenge you on that. What do you have to hide? After all, you work for me and everyone else. And I think good teachers would be proud to show what they can do. I know they would, because I had a lot of good teachers in my life, including my parents, who were professional teachers as well. The other thing about that is looking at where we're headed. You know, are we headed, for the medical passport, the digital currency, all that? Yeah, I wrote about it 20 years ago. It's here right now. We're watching it unfold in front of us. As the gateway into your life, to barge into your personal life. Remember HIPAA, the right to keep all your medical stuff private? Now they're going to database it. Great. Without any safeguards for you. In fact, the opposite. No safeguards for you at all. You're just a commodity now, traded in a different way, and that takes us into the next way. It's called the medical industry. 18% of the U.S. economy and growing. I'll bet you it's 25% with all this COVID money flying around and how little of the regular economy is working. And you got to strip out the finance money, because that's just puff money. It's going into the same pockets at the end. We are sitting on the brink of disaster here. The money that's been dished out, a few trillion more, this is going to have a very different impact. My oldest son pointed this out, and he's dead on right. The earlier impact of spending all the money under Trump, it finally hit the finance sector mainly. Didn't buy a lot of consumer goods. People were busy just hanging on to everything, and whatever money came down or, trickled down there, didn't stay very long. You add up all this money, the trillions and trillions that have been spent, this is like $65,000 per household. If they'd just given every household of four about 65 grand, I don't think anybody would be worrying about much for a few years. But that isn't the way it played out. In fact, not only would they not be worrying, those people would actually be spending the money in an economy, creating economic activity. Okay, now that's about to happen, only differently. They got a $2 trillion infrastructure bill that's about to happen. Well, there aren't enough trained people to do any of that work. There's not enough truck drivers. They're already short. They can't even deliver the freight they've got. Things are backed up like crazy in the middle of this thing. They don't have enough professional truck drivers, equipment operators, welders, any of those skilled crafts, because we haven't been educating for that. We don't have that. And those that do show up are going to inflate the price of that labor, and all the materials that aren't available right now to do construction. Lumber prices have almost doubled. Most commodities are on the way up. Go take a look. They just didn't have the consumer price index yet. They will get more into that. But on the medical side, when you think about what happens, first of all, this medical standardization, the PDR, what they're telling people, and they want to tell all of us, is that we have to accept their version of medical care. Not your version, their version. Whatever they decide is going to happen to your body, your carrier, they're going to decide. Now, there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision years ago called Roe versus Wade, right, on the abortion issue, where a woman's body was hers and hers alone to decide everything about what went in, what went out. How has that changed now with this vaccine, or anything else in terms of what's going to happen to my body. This is my body. This is my carrier. This is what I own free from everyone. And no government has the right to penetrate this body, except if I say yes. Period. How we do that, when do we draw the line on this? Are we going to accept a PDR, because that's what we almost had with this national healthcare thing where that's your only choice? What about the alternative cares? Many of those that I've mentioned earlier today. That's a tip of an iceberg, and I'm demonstrating things that are now 15 years old or older. The stuff that's out there now is really phenomenal, and what's coming is even more phenomenal. We're going to be able to grow organs, your own, with your own DNA. Stem cell research will let us extract our own stem cells from this body and create our own organs that are DNA perfect. That's coming. We're going to see that happen in our lifetimes. We may get to the point where you can 3D print that even. That's coming. We have the merger of nanotechnologies, quantum computing, biosciences. All of the sciences are merging at a level that is unprecedented. When quantum computing comes in, huge problems can be resolved and bigger problems created. We'll get more into that. But what the medical system has done at this amount of our economy is essentially stripping out the wealth of the country. It's a huge wealth transfer. Here in Anchorage, we have the Good Sisters of Providence, the Catholic Charities of Providence Hospital, a national chain. I'm picking on them because they are a greedy, selfish organization that I resent on such deep levels for what they've done in my state. At this hospital, tens and tens of millions of dollars, up to $100 million, is made as a profit and sent out of my state. There are people dying all through my state, from alcohol, drug abuse, all kinds of things associated with the medical establishment. And they're taking up to $100 million a year in profits out of Alaska. And in Alaska, we have the highest insurance costs for medical insurance in the world. Not in the United States, in the freaking world. I have a friend my age paying $2,500 a month for his insurance, $30,000 a year to have any kind of coverage that would cover him for anything. That's insane, all right? That's crazy. This hospital, this non-profit hospital and its chain, when COVID began, had over $100 billion in their cash reserves, $12 billion in their, this is national, in their national emergency reserves, and then they took $573 million of yours and my tax money to add to that reserve during COVID, along with whatever else they've been able to bill, and I'm sure their profits are up. Now, is that right? They're a nonprofit 501c3 doing charitable work. But they don't pay a penny in taxes, but they took $573 million nationally, took $100 million out of my community, and I don't know how many tens of millions this year. But every dime they spend, I hope they change the laws about nonprofits. They make the money in your state, they spend the money in your state, especially these hospitals. This is a corrupt operation. You know what the average hospital, what the private ones do? I knew a private CEO of a hospital, he's not working in the industry, he told me 30%. Imagine all that medical care, millions and millions, they gotta make 30% margins. Yeah, a lot of money. For EKG in Anchorage, I might spend $400. I can go to the best place in the world in the lower 48, the Mayo Clinic, and pay $40. How do you figure 10 times? How do you figure? This is a corrupt thing. One of the things they have in the medical profession are called certificates of needs. Most states have them. Medical professions lobby for them. What are those? They say that you can't build a facility in my state over $1 million, a medical facility, without somebody's permission. A little committee that decides how much competition ought to exist. Hey, when you pay as high as we do, it ought to be, the road is cleared, come on in if you can beat these prices. But they don't post their prices. You go to get your car repaired, they give you an estimate, and guess what? If they mess it up, you're not paying more. How come you can't get that on your vehicle, your carrier, right? I mean, want to talk about cost of care? How about fairness in an open capitalist society? How about everybody post their prices so you can see what you're paying for? How about asking a doctor how much the surgery will cost? He can't tell you. Germany, they can. Everywhere else in the world, they can. How come they can't tell you here? That's called consumer fraud, see, in the rest of the world, but we give it other nice names called billing codes. You know, 40,000 billing codes are about to hit the PDR when there ought to be 5 or 6. It ought to be simplified, not made more costly and complicated. We're doing it the opposite way. Here's what also happens at the end of your life. You don't get your Social Security kind of medical benefits unless you've exhausted your resources up to a certain point. So if you get destitute, you know, you first spend everything. You got to give it all away first to the establishment, unless you set up a medical trust 3 years before you're chronically ill. This is a secret. The rich guy knows it. 3 years before. So you set up your trust early, put all your property in your trust, and when you're medically ill, the medical industry doesn't strip out your wealth. That's how wealthy people preserve themselves from the medical industry. But you don't. You just get your wealth stripped out and handed off at the end because you don't do trusts. They're not that expensive. The new tax laws will probably change that. They're doing a lot of changes. I don't know whether that's good or bad. It's just another way to pick your pocket. But you look at tort reform as the other part. Okay, now we just heard all about the opiate epidemic from these, and they are assholes too. I got to say it twice. There's a second time. Because they got everyone addicted and told all these MDs that these were not addictive substances. And then when they decided to look at places like a county in West Virginia where they had sold like 8 million doses, which for a county of some small number, and you know, they have ways to track that. They used to have, they would be able to, you know, track the volume going in, and then they would be able to catch up with these pharmacologists or doctors that were doing this kind of nonsense, so people were getting these drugs. Well, then they shut off the ability to do that because they lobbied for Congress not to do that anymore because they didn't want to get caught anymore. Come on, ladies and gentlemen. They got caught because they were wrong. And so instead of addressing the fact they're wrong and creating better mechanisms to catch more of these people, they did the opposite. Because it's the industries that run Congress. We're going to get into that later, but the medical industry is one of the biggest lobbyists. They have a fifth of the economy, 1 out of $5. You know, they get to tell people what to do, who will listen, and they do listen. Tort reform was about not being able to sue doctors, right, and hospitals for malpractice. Now let's think about this. I get the idea that the doctor doesn't want to lose the alligator golf bag revenue stream. I get that. Okay, I wouldn't either. All right, but when I think about tort reform, the biggest area where there's medical malpractice is drug interactions. That's it. Half of them. Half the deaths, 100,000 die from that every year. That's about 8 times as many as die from gunshots. How many medical malpractice suits do you read about in the newspaper? I'm just talking the United States. 100,000, that's according to Harvard, and I believe the number's about double that these days. But that's a good number. Gunshots are about 20,000, maybe. Today they were about 15 when those stats were out. So, you know, we look at things, we draw our attention to certain things, other things we ignore. Medical malpractice. The drug interactions being most of it, and you know how easy that is? Centralized prescription databases that you get to make sure all of the prescribing physicians about you, so they're there. And then computers can sort that out because doctors can't. It's too complicated. Between the supplements you take and the drugs you may be on, the interactions are impossible for any MD to sort out. It has to be done by computer now. It's too complicated. So it can be done, should be done. Half of medical malpractice would go away, but insurance companies and others don't want to share the data. That's the truth of the matter. Centralized billing is for the same reason. A centralized, simplified billing with less codes would reduce the cost of administration dramatically, but they don't want to share the data. So you got to force them. You've got to force it. My dad, when he was doing education in Alaska, why did he go to the legislature, the Senate? He tried to do it through the unions, the teachers' unions. They were worthless. Tried to do it through the school districts and administrations. They were worthless as they are today. Nothing's changed. So he went to Juneau, the capital of Alaska, and wrote law and packed it down educators' throats with many of their cooperation. The teachers, the ones who wanted to deliver better education. They were the ones that my dad listened to because they were the ones educating our kids, and they were the ones doing the job. Everybody else was in the way, more or less. And he worked his way through that whole process. You know, when he was a principal, he organized a statewide principals association that exists to this day. When he was a superintendent in his 20s, he organized the State Superintendents Association. It still exists to this day. When he was in the legislature, he created the teachers' retirement system and the public employees' retirement system and the collective bargaining system and special education and the first kindergartens and the first rural health care, and on and on and on and on and on. Because a good leader has the energy and the knowledge to go on and on and on. And what you've been watching here for hours is a leader. I'm not running for anything, but this is what you should demand of leadership, or they're not qualified. If they can't do this, if they can't articulate solutions that are real, then they're just BSers feeding you fertilizer when it's not. It's BS and you're eating it. Quit. Demand performance from these people, and don't let them off the hook with 2-minute debates run by teleprompters. You know, don't look at this president right now. He won't even do a press conference openly and honestly because he can't talk. Now, it's not because he couldn't once upon a time. I'm sure he could, but he can't now. And anyone dumb enough to not see that is dumb. Just plain dumb, or just doesn't want to believe what they see. Why do we have a closed government when we need it open right now? We need a president that stands in front of us that gives us confidence right now. Is this the best? These two guys that just ran this thing? Really? I don't believe it. They're the worst because they're manipulated in some fashion or another. Or they have such low character. You know, Trump got in there in error because they didn't have anyone better. And you know who people voted for? The guy that was at least as flawed as he was appeared to be honest about it. Yeah, he was ugly and everybody saw it. I wish we had had somebody that was respectful, that we could respect, that had the character that we'd like reflected, not some bully. But sometimes you need an asshole, is what somebody told me once. Somebody told me this once, a union organizer, and it was a guy and he was really a jerk. And he said, yeah, he's an asshole, but he's our asshole and everybody needs one. Think about that. You know, that's kind of a crazy thing to say, but when you think about it, you wouldn't live very long without one. And you know, as much as we've been kicked around in the world for a lot of different things, sometimes you need somebody who's just a bully. Just one term of a bully might help reset a few things, or at least do it. I wish it was a polite guy, though, and not a bully as such, but somebody who knew their strength and was confident in the nation enough to know who we are and didn't need to be a bully about it. Because who we are when we're who we are is pretty powerful. But we're not that list of felonious things that our government's doing in our name, and that's how we're seen. When people meet Americans, I travel all over the world, they like Americans. When they meet us one-on-one, they don't think much of our government. And those are kind of the reasons why. In our name, they've done a lot of damage. We need to take our name back. We need to take back control of who we are again. Medical establishment, a lot of people mean well. They do their best, I'm sure of it. But the systems do not allow them to do their best. Doctors should be free to be medical professionals. They're trained to take care of your health. Give them the latitude to do that. Get them the latitude to bill fairly. Recognize their professionalism. Treat them as the professionals they are. Don't tell them what to think and don't tell them what to write. These guys, the institutions, the pharmaceutical industry, let me tell you how to reform that a little bit. I mentioned earlier what percentage of pharmaceuticals in America are from advertising, 40% of the cost. Now, why do we pay 1 nickel more in America at the wholesale level for a pharmaceutical drug when someone on the other side of the planet pays substantially less? That should not be allowed. A lot of the research comes out of institutions that we pay for, public institutions, public research, that then turns into private patents for private companies, that then allows them to charge whatever they want for healing products. And they do. Whatever the market will bear, wherever it will bear it. Now you can't stop them from advertising because that's illegal. They have free speech. And like the tobacco industry, people say, well, we stopped them from advertising. Yeah, because they needed to settle a lawsuit because they lie, right? To everybody and said it's all safe and wonderful. So they had to give up the right to their speech. So here's the way you take care of it with the pharmaceutical industry. Think of all those ads you see about things you can't buy because they're all prescription. Simple solution. You can't tell them they can't say it, but you can tell them by regulation they can no longer take it as a tax deduction. And as soon as you tell them that 40% of their expenses are no longer deductible, they have to come out of shareholders' profits, I guarantee you the money will not be spent on advertising, targeting you, a consumer who cannot make the decision to buy that product, and then can no longer put the pressure on your doctor to prescribe something that you may not need. That would be a good move. That would knock 40% of your price of prescriptions out tomorrow. Okay? That's a simple solution within this industry to take it back. The other would be to say to the pharmaceutical industry that A, you can't charge more anywhere else in the world, and then you create a whistleblower mechanism to make it really profitable for the guy that tells on them to get a percentage of that. And then you hold boards, the boards that run these companies and their officers, criminally liable, so they go to jail. See, their corporations get free speech. They can say anything. They can interfere with elections. They can do all kinds of things. They can influence Congress even. And they do. They decide who gets elected and what they come out with in legislation. But none of them can go to jail because we don't let that happen. Their corporations are protected. Pierce the veil. You want free speech? You want to live like a human being? Then you go to jail like one. You want to sit on the boards of these companies? You want to serve as their officers? Your employees better be following the law and respecting civil rights and civil liberties. Because it ought to be criminal, you see, to take our data and kick in our digital doorway. We need to rewrite the rules. Make you liable for when you violate us. Turn those cameras around a little bit. We need to extend the Freedom of Information Act to private companies with a whistleblower mechanism so they can tell on you. Right? You know, as a little kid, I'm telling. Hey, this time we ought to be telling because it's our government that we're telling to listen again to us. So we need whistleblowers mechanisms now. We need ways in. We need ombudsmen. We need ways in. We need people who work in these nonprofits who see this kind of abuse to be able to come forward and say, hey, they shouldn't even have this exemption. It's just a money machine. We need some honesty in some of this. We need to break some of this down a little differently. The Hippocratic Oath is about healing, not stealing. Healing, not stealing. Start with a few different letters at the front of those words, and you get a little different place. That's not the heart of healers. This is the heart of technicians and people who like to make a lot of money, who don't think about health care. They think about what they call systems of health, which are cash registers. Because I've been all through this health thing, and there are very few that operate as a system of anything. Believe me, they don't. They don't even talk to each other. They refer and don't follow up. They're too busy. They get 5 minutes per client. That's not medical. It's a prescription machine. How many are you on? I'm 62. I'm on 0. Do I look unhealthy? Nope, because I've avoided that system as much as I could. And I'm healthy. Choices are about health. Lifestyles are about health. Thinking about what you're doing is your health. And we're not. We're in too big of a rush. We're in too big of a hurry, and everything is prepackaged, preformed, prepacked, pre-programmed for you. Oh, but you're conveniently served. But I don't think so. Let's talk about medical alternatives. We talked about reducing the number of codes, deductibility we talked about a little bit, nonprofits and where the money really goes in the medical care, certificate of needs, again, limiting competition. I want to make clear on that one. Again, go back to that just for a second. That means if I wanted to build another hospital to make more beds in Anchorage, I couldn't do it. If I wanted to do it with my own money for cash, they would not let me do it. I'd have to get permission of a committee that says, yes, we have the need. The same for MRI machines, and we pay $4,000 to get one. At one point now, I think it's down to $1,500. And here's the other upside down part. You know, if you pay cash, you pay the highest price for medical care in hospitals. The biggest discount is to the biggest insurance company. And they pay the worst, but they get the biggest discount. But you pay cash, you get screwed. Really, you do. To the nonprofit down the road. Now, what Providence does, I got to say this, if you can't pay and you're poor and you make your case, they'll let you go. I've seen them do that. Yep, they do. But so will everybody, because if you can't collect, you don't. You know, they just are nicer about it. So they give the guy a little bit of kindness on their way through the process. But again, they'll still sell out the collection notices. They'll still turn you over. They're not that charitable. Public funds and patent limits. This is another one. You know, we heard some of these disputes a number of years ago where people bought up companies and then tripled and quadrupled the price of certain medications, inhalers and things that are really critical to people, for people with allergies, lots of different things. You know, that is wrong morally, I'm sure. And you remember this one I heard a lot too. You know, you can't legislate morality. You remember that? We see that associated with the right to life issue. You can't legislate morality. That's another oxymoron, because every law is about legislating morality. A law is exactly that. That's what a law is. It's saying this is a moral principle and perimeter that we're not going against as a community, so this is a law. That's what they are. It's, again, you know, we use words to twist things around in these weird ways. Yes, you do legislate morality. We do it with every law we pass. That's what we do. We decide what our limits are. And we've decided in a number of cases that the body of a human being is your own, but the medical industry thinks it belongs to them, including when you're on your deathbed and they're stripping out the last of your wealth. Certificates of need, all that does is limit competition, wipe them out, forget it, let them live or die by competition, force them to post prices, no more of this nebulous stuff. Post the prices, they ought to be seen, they ought to be known, no more hiding pricing for pharmaceuticals, for medical care of any kind. Absolute transparency and cost will solve a lot of this. It'll allow you to pick who you want, and then their record. You want to know whether you got an A restaurant, a B restaurant, or C restaurant. You can go eat food in a restaurant and find out what it is in California and a lot of other places. Put the label right in the window. I'm not eating in a C restaurant. I don't want that many mice hairs in my food. Okay? How come we don't see that at a doctor's office? How many malpractice cases do you have that you've lost? Might want to know that, you know. Can the guy do the job? Has he failed a few times? How many people have brought him up on ethical complaints that are hidden behind the board of his peers? Because that's how lawyers and doctors do it. Professional boards with one member of the public and a bunch of them. Okay, we got to rethink this. You need to see performance records and costs so you can make the determinations you would make in other consumer decisions. Are you getting your money's worth? And how much is it? You know, that's called capitalism, ladies and gentlemen. A price and competition. Let's put that in the medical field, and it ain't going to be 18% of your economy anymore. Just pricing it. Just making pricing fair and getting whistleblower mechanisms in to catch the cheaters. And reward them generously for their information. And guess what? Eventually there won't be very many cheaters because they know they can go to jail, and it's less comfortable there. And so let's do that. Make people accountable by just changing simple rules. These are keys, again, these are keys for the medical changes that might be necessary. And let's recognize that our bodies truly are our own, and we should decide our medical care, and that the alternatives ought to be included. That we ought, if we're being forced to have medical care, it ought to be the ones we choose. And whatever that insurance is, get your legislators at the state level to change it. In Washington State, you can get acupuncture. I can't get it in Alaska. Other states, you can get rolfing. I can't get it here. This state, you can get massage. I can't get that in other places. Why not? These things work. How about I decide my medical care? Insurers decide, yeah, okay, we'll cover the alternatives. And the government say, you're going to cover it all. You know? And who decides whether the alternatives are good? I think you do. And if they want to figure out some other complexion, great. But quit telling me how to spend my money and what my limits are on what my insurance is and who I can spend it with. These are all questions. And when you're wasting 40% of the medical cost for pharmaceuticals alone on advertising, and you're screwing the cash buyer, and you're not being honest with your pricing, and you're expecting me to buy into this system, I expect to be paying the lowest price. And the law ought to say so, that whatever the lowest price is negotiated by anybody for medical care, it ought to be for everyone. And when you're a nonprofit, you ought to be profiting at zero. In this community, the money profit should be zero. When you leave at the end of the year, it ought to go, okay, whatever's left, we're throwing back into health care, not someone else's pocket. And I definitely feel strongly about that headed for the Pope through the Catholic Church, because the same time they're exporting that money, my city is giving Catholic charities money for the homeless in grants. Wait a minute. What is going on here? We're playing musical shuffleboard and the only winners are out of town. And that's happening everywhere. Our wealth is being stripped out by the medical profession in a number of ways. And your future wealth, the one that could sustain your next generation, because you don't know what the big families know and you don't have a trust. Talk to an attorney, find out what a trust is. There's cheap. Don't go to any attorney. Find the one that only does trusts, because he's the one that is the cheapest, because he knows what he's doing. And they even do seminars. Learn about this stuff. Take the time. Otherwise, your wealth is gone. You know, and I'm jumping now, I'm going to jump completely out of this, and I'm going to jump into government. And this is where this is going to get a lot more fun, I hope. Because this is where the action is of change. And so I'm going to start, as we come back into the next section, with Alaska, the government I know the most, and talk about how you build a government, because I got to do it in terms of seeing it happen. On the tribal level, then I'm going to go there where I got to do it with really great tribal people, help them build their government. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about homelessness, because in my world here in Alaska, it's mostly Native Americans, and I want to talk about it in a broader sense of history and what's happening here. And then leadership, I'm going to talk quickly on that. And then I'm going to talk about American government. I've already disclosed a lot of what's in there, so I won't have to repeat myself. So that'll go fairly quickly. And then I'm going to talk about the emerging China and Russia and what's happening there. And then we still have a bit to go, but that'll take us up to page 31. I got 37 pages of notes, so we're getting closer. We got a ways to go. I know people are getting tired, but remember, this feed is going to be a constant feed. Whatever glitches has been, the guys here have been laying down a separate track, so they're going to clean that all up, and so we're going to get this reloaded into the internet clean. Now, we're already in our second reel, because we burned up 10 hours, and they won't let us do more than that on YouTube on one program, so now we're on program 2. We're working into the next 10 hours. I really am trying to get it done, too, in this next 10 hours. My team's getting tired, but I'm not. We have a lot to say. We have a lot to do, and this is just the beginning of the next 50 years and closing out 50. So we got a ways to go tonight, and we're going to take a little break. We'll be back shortly. Testing 1, 2, 3. Everything's go.
And you are live.
Okay, we're back. I know that was a shorter break, and we're trying to keep them shorter and keep things moving. The next area I want to talk about is Alaska, and this is, again, kind of the big issue for me, at least in terms of my life and history. When my dad got here in the mid-50s, it was a really different place. The average age of Native Americans here was less than 40. So people had seen a lot of death by then. My dad was excited about arriving, and kind of the way he got here. He had been active in the Democratic Party in Minnesota, northern Minnesota, on the Iron Range, in a small town called Eveleth. And there he had met Hubert Humphrey when he was running his first time for the U.S. Senate. And in that race, they became friends, and Dad was just a really strong worker. And so Humphrey encouraged my dad to go to Alaska. There were a lot of opportunities here, and a young person would have a lot more opportunity here than Minnesota. And Humphrey helped my dad get a job as an inspector on a federal project here in Alaska. And that lasted about 6 months. When my dad did get here, he didn't really care for that kind of work. He wanted to be in education. He was educated as a teacher. But it was so different. You know, he ended up, of course, teaching school, and then he ended up teaching at night too at the university. And his area and his specialty was Russian history. And of course, Alaska has a lot of Russian history because we were, in fact, a Russian colony at one point. And I want to talk about sort of the pre-statehood conditions, because that's where my dad arrived here. We weren't a state yet. It was still a territory. We came up the Elkhorn Highway, which was built predominantly by black soldiers during the World War II. And it was a horrible assignment to be cutting a road through the middle of nowhere. But it was a way in which supply fortified to move things into Russia, and then on from there into the Eastern Front. And so this Alaska all of a sudden strategically became important. And if you look at where we're situated in the world, you'll understand that importance even more if you look at a globe. And one of the callers I had on a national radio show the other day brought it up, the Arctic. And this is well known here, what we've got going. And there's a lot of reasons the Arctic is well positioned. If you think about where Europe is, Asia is, and the Americas, this is kind of the hub, Alaska. And so FedEx and UPS both organized their international hubs for the Northern Hemisphere here in Alaska. UPS has Fairbanks Airport, and Federal Express has Anchorage. And they're building in Anchorage a 700,000 square foot warehouse. And they're going to be doing a lot more of that in Anchorage and in Fairbanks to support international traffic over the Northern Hemisphere as trade moves between these three primary continents. All the air traffic used to run through Anchorage when Soviet air traffic was restricted. So we used to have daily and even twice daily flights refueling in Anchorage, taking us into Europe. We could be in Europe 9 hours, 10 hours, any European city every day of the week, because every major airlines came through Anchorage. When they opened Russian airspace, Soviet airspace, all of that then changed because more direct routes became possible. But still, Anchorage and Fairbanks, because of the situation, are some of the busiest cargo routes in the world, actually. Most people don't know that because, again, we have small population. But think about proximity. And I've talked about the size of Alaska at other times, but think about this. It's about 18%, almost a fifth of the entire land mass of the United States. This state, from where I'm sitting here to the tip of the Aleutian Islands, almost touches Japan and Russia. It's about 15, 18, almost 2,000 miles across all the way down. And then you look at, from where I'm sitting going the other direction towards the east, and you're talking about almost 1,500 miles, almost all the way to Seattle when you look at the panhandle of Alaska, as they call it. And then if you look north from where I am to get to the top of my state, it's 700 miles. You know, that's like from New York to Washington, D.C. is only 225, you know, so just to get some perspective again. And that's just within my own state. You know, you only get a third of the way from there. You could cut Alaska into, or cut Alaska in half, and then Texas would be the third largest state. The north of the state, above the Brooks Range, is the size of Montana. 8,000 people live there. It's an entire oil basin. Oil, coal, unbelievable resources on the North Slope all the way out into the Arctic Ocean. That whole area is strategic. We'll talk more about it later. But Alaska, when we were bought from Russia, it was kind of a weird transaction. We negotiated what they called the Treaty of Secession, where they gave up any claim to Alaska in exchange for 2 cents an acre and that was 1865, right after the Civil War was ending. And we paid $7 million for the whole place. I mean, what a deal. And I talked about the landmass, the coastal area of Alaska, because the way it's situated with all those islands and all the areas that stretch out. The coastal area of Alaska, now federal waters are 200 miles out, so that's a big distance, you know. Alaska is bigger around the coast than the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, and the West Coast of the rest of the United States combined. Not separately, combined. Take it all, combine it, we're still a bigger coastline. And that translates into 200 miles worth of resources. The state boundary is the first 3 miles. That's what states have. After that, it's federal jurisdiction for 200. That changed during the 70s. It used to be a closer limit. It was during my dad's time in Congress that limit extended 200 miles. And it was driven a lot by the arguments in Alaska because our fisheries were being plundered by the fleets of Asia and Europe who were just plundering the fisheries here on the high seas. They still are. And that was a big part of what was happening then, was protecting the fisheries, the food supplies, which go back to Alaska's early days even. And we'll talk about that as I get to that stage of our history. But after the Treaty of Secession, the Russians gave it up. They figured the way we were coming across the West, we were going to take it anyway sooner or later. They might as well give it up. And they needed the money. The Tsar needed the money. So that's how that happened. They gave it up. They thought it was all fished out, furred out. They were basically involved in the fur trade. And they had wiped out a few species even along the way, but they were basically taking the fur from here. They were trading then in Hawaii for things, and they were headed to China, and they traded the fur there for opium, and they did the big route. It was an opium and fur trading route, among other things. But these were the big trade routes of that time, of the 1700s and 1800s. When we got it, they thought it was all over with. And then they discovered both copper and gold and precious metals in Alaska. And of course, everybody knows about the Alaska Gold Rush of 1898. In that, one of the big ones was copper, and the Guggenheim and Morgan Trust. You remember the Morgan Banking Trust? They show up a lot in our history. And the Guggenheims were an interesting group. They were Jewish folks that had immigrated to the United States, and they came here in the 1800s, and they sold what they called stovepipe polish. It's what you would use on the stovepipes coming off a wood stove to keep them black. And then from there, they made it out to Colorado during the silver rushes and the gold rushes that were going on in the West, and they ended up getting involved heavily in silver and copper. And then when things began to happen in Alaska, they came to Alaska and they cornered the copper market basically for World War I and then later for World War II. This is a big deal because a lot of copper gets used in a lot of bullets and brass. You know, that's all copper. And so what happened with the Guggenheims and Morgans when they came to Alaska, there were no people here hardly at all. So they had to produce hay for horses and food for people and bring people here. And eggs during the gold rush were $1 each. That was, put that in your head, gold was only $20 an ounce. Gold right now is about $1,700 an ounce, almost $1,800 an ounce today. So in perspective, you know, I mean, certain things were really pricey because they weren't available, and other things were a different deal. So here's no people, they discover copper in Kennecott. So rich they couldn't believe it. You know, in fact, how it went is they had to build a railroad to get to it through the most treacherous places on earth. And they did, and they pulled out what today would be billions of dollars, the highest grade copper. The first train load, which was stockpiled before the rail arrived, the first rail load out paid for the whole works. That's what they had found. There's a hole there. They ran a television thing for years. The guy that owned that mine, the next year after the series ended, they got their guy in, and he rappelled down into an 800-foot cavern, taller than the Empire State Building, that was hollowed out, where they took out chalcocite ore that was like 70% copper, straight out of the ground, and hauled it off. So the Guggenheims had made a gazillion dollars. Why did they leave here? Well, for all the reasons I mentioned, but while they were here, they cornered the timber and the fish, and what they did with the fish, they just netted the whole river. They just stopped everything when the migrating species came out, and they starved out everybody up the river. They were dying in these villages. They took everything. These canneries took it all, and they shipped it south to Seattle. They shipped the ore to Seattle. They cut all the timber they could. They shipped it all out of here. And they were destroying everything along the way. Well, then they discovered copper in Chile and Peru. And there was a lot of labor there. There were a lot of indigenous people, and they were cheap, and they had their own housing and grew their own food, so you didn't even have to provide much for them. So off they went, and you know what they did is they pulled up all the railroad track with them, so nobody in that mining district would ever do a thing again. And I own, with partners, the second most important deposit in that I acquired a number of years ago, and have quietly been doing some work out there. We've got the Elliott Hubbard mine, which is the same type of ore, just on the other end of the mineral belt. But now it's within a giant park and preserve, and we're going to talk about that as we get into this conversation about Alaska. Because this is a place where it kind of got played out more or less in a couple of generations, not 250 years, but in the last 100 or so. In terms of what's going on in the modern time. So gold, copper, timber, fish, that was the first kind of grab and go. And then we got into the Depression period where everything kind of slowed down. There were still a bunch of old independent gold miners. They were still running around. There were still people trying to make a living. And then we had World War II start. And now this was over, because here's what we did. Unlike the Canadians, what we did is we said all non-essential industries are over. So the entire gold mining industry ended. All of it ended. The only thing that could be mined were strategically important metals. And so most of what was happening in Alaska was scrapping out all the metal that had ever come in here and shipping it out to get put into the war effort. Mining stopped for all practical purposes here. And then gold, of course, during the Roosevelt period, was frozen at $35 an ounce. And then after the war, everything had quadrupled in price, labor, materials, everything. So it wasn't economic to restart the engines and reinvigorate these properties and these mines. So they just died. The whole industry kind of faded away and went away. In Canada, they did the opposite. They subsidized their industry a little bit, and they kept it alive. And today in the world, and Australia did something similar. Today in the world, the most aggressive, what they call junior mining companies, are the British Columbian, the Canadian companies, and the Australians. And it's because they kept it alive. We let it all die. Here in Alaska, everyone doing anything up here of any size is from somewhere else. They're not from the United States. Our biggest trading partners are Asia. China just left here. They'd like to have the whole place. They're working really hard on it. They got a few friends here that are working with them because they like the money, and they're greedy bastards. They really are. But that's what they're doing. They're going to sell this place out because they can afford it. We're going to talk about how come that's going to happen, because we've priced ourselves out of the market. You know, we can't even ship the goods out of Alaska to a U.S. port economically. Even though those ports are less than half the distance to China, it cost 1/10 the money to ship the same ton of ore to China as it does to ship it to a U.S. port, because of a piece of legislation called the Jones Act, which says shipping between U.S. ports must be done by U.S. flagged vessels, which means they're made in the USA. And shipbuilding in the USA is a very expensive proposition. As a consequence, most shipping from Alaska, a lot of it goes U.S. port, Canadian port, U.S. port. This allows you to use foreign flagged vessels. But if you're using a U.S. flagged vessel to get to a U.S. port, then you're going to pay 10 times the freight charge, because that's just the way the economy works, because of the Jones Act. And we don't have a railroad to give us the other option, which would be to railroad it, which is also a cheap form, to railroad it straight through Canada and on down into what is now the Rust Belt, where they could have at one point done something with that raw ore. We can still do that. It's not too late. The Canadians have aggressively moved their rail north. I've seen it. They're almost there, because they're punching it to follow the resources north. We can fork off of that. We can bring it right into the rail system that exists in Alaska today and extend that rail system throughout Alaska like we did through the West. Through the other fifth of the country we've missed. Go look at a road map and a rail map. There's nothing here. This is the treasury of the nation. We're going to talk a lot about that because the treasury of the nation is being looted again. And you know, I'll give you a good example. British Petroleum, up until the mid-80s, 25% of British Petroleum was owned by the British Crown. Right. The same people that colonized America all those years ago owned 25% of British Petroleum when they owned 50% of the oil coming off of the North Slope of Alaska. Were we still a colony? The British Crown thought so, because they were still collecting a lot, because they kept it up until the decline of the volume started going down. Then they sold it. Hey, we plucked this one clean for the best of the best. Now it's off of 2 million barrels a day plus. It's dropping fast. The price is dropping. Adios, Alaska. Your partners are gone. We've looted enough for now. But they've all done this. All of them have done this. And they continue to do this, and we invite them in as our partners when they're not. See, these oil resources that they've been working, they're our tenants, not partners. They are our tenants. They lease this from us. And there's good reasons why maybe we ought not to be doing that within the context of Alaska, and I can talk about that in this sense. 78 or 80% of the world's oil is produced now by national oil companies, like Denmark. You know, for instance, like when you look at what companies do with when they own their oil and they develop their own oil, like Norway and others, you develop a lot of wealth. And if you can retain that wealth, it can do a lot for your region. Now here in Alaska, we'll get to that. We did that. We retained it in a way that really is unusual. It gives us the potential to fund our entire government without any taxation of the people that live here. We're going to get into that a little bit because this is an interesting model, Alaska, one that most people don't know much about, and we should know about it. This is our country, right? One of the first forms of taxation in Alaska was a 3% fish tax back in the early days before statehood. And what was it for? For schools. Because again, as I said earlier, the first thing people organize is schools and sheriffs usually. And they pay for it out of their own money, and we were no different. So we said, how are we going to do this? And it was a fish tax. And I mentioned a little bit about the Morgan Trust and some of the Alaska mining history. One of the people that enlightened me on some of that history was a woman named Audrey Corey. And Audrey, when I met her, I was 14, and she was, I think, 68 or 70. And she had been a territorial nurse in Alaska when they used dog sleds to get around in the 20s. The 1920s. I got a vision of Alaska from her because I used to go there because she was also involved as a gemologist, involved in that trade, and her brother Tony taught me how to cut stones and how to do that, how to do lapidary work, and they're the ones who encouraged me to study gemology and to do all of that. But I got the best stories of Alaska, and when I later went to work for Chickaloon Village, she was related at the end to my adopted grandmother, right? I mean, it's weird how things circle back around. And she was a Caucasian woman, but she'd had all these experiences that were rich and deep, and they were all about people and relationships with very unusual people. The Jones Act I mentioned because that gets in the way. Now, my dad, in his first year in Congress, got an amendment to the Jones Act. Nobody thought that could happen. And that amendment allowed the Wickersham to sail here, which was a foreign flag vessel, and it allowed us to have passenger traffic in parts of our state that have no roads, and a ferry system, the Marine Highway we call it, which is in jeopardy now. We used to operate when we had no money. Now we can't seem to figure out how to operate it at all, and it's a mess. But it's a way that we can't even drive to our state cap, hide down there when they ought to be here where the population is. But again, it's Alaska. It's a little bit differently. But Alaska represents the balance sheet of the nation. You know, when we talk about national budgets, they always want to talk about cash in, cash out, the cash flow, the P&L statement, we call that in business. They never talk about the balance sheet, the wealth of the nation. Well, what is that? Well, that's how much everything is worth that we own in common, which is most of the nation, actually, when you think of public lands. We'll talk about that later because it wasn't supposed to be that way. The federal government, at least, wasn't supposed to have this much land, but they do. It's supposed to be states and individuals eventually that had land. And we'll talk about that when we talk about what's happened in terms of land and land rights. Here in Alaska, I'll give you the examples. 100% of the land, 1/5 of the nation. 1% of this state, representing 1/5 of the nation, is owned by private parties, like you and me. 1%. 9% has been repatriated to the Native Americans that were here first, with all the rights intact. That means you got 10%. The rest is state and federal land. That doesn't make any sense to me. That wasn't what was planned here. Now, most of that's federal land because what we did here was different than other states. When we had our Statehood Act, well, we were smart, we thought, and we said, we don't care about the surface of state, we want the wealth under the land, oil, gas, minerals. So whatever the federal government gets under their land, we get 90%. That was our deal under statehood. We get 90% of all the rents and royalties under all federal land, and then whatever we can negotiate on our own land, the 104 million acres that we got to keep. And then there's 44 million acres that Native Americans got to keep. And then there's, a little bit left over for everybody else. And on my land in the middle of the Wrangell Mountains, it's 812 acres of patents. I have it all, water rights, mineral rights, surface estate, the whole thing with my partners. And we predate statehood. We predate everybody. 1904, signed by the President of the United States, those patents and land surveys. But now we don't get the same kind of things happening in all of this. For instance, when land is transferred, you don't get all those other rights are reserved to the state. The water rights go to the state. The underlying mineral rights are reserved separately. You got to claim those separately under certain rules and regulations. It used to be that anyone, 18 and over, an American citizen, could go out and make a discovery of valuable minerals on federal land, make a claim according to a set of rules, pay a few bucks for recording it, and poof, it was yours to go process and mine. And if you could prove by the prudent man test, which was that it was an economic adventure, you could gain a patent which gave you full title, like what I have on my land. And then you had the right to do something. And that's how mineral titles were transferred. And if you were a person and you wanted to go homestead some land until the early 1970s, not 1870s, 1970s, you could still homestead federal land in Alaska. Now in the 60s, you could still get up to 160 acres. By the 70s, they'd restricted it quite a bit. You get home sites of about, I think they were 5 acres, and you get commercial sites around 5 acres. But you could still make a homestead. And what did that mean? That meant you went out, you staked the corners, and then you improved the land for a certain number of years, and then it was yours. You got a title, a patent from the federal government, and you got to own it. And that's how land transferred for a few hundred years here in the country, and then stopped, and the federal government just started holding it all. And then they did some things in Alaska that are very different. And my dad was right in the middle of it. Now, Alaska, as a strategic location, of all the strategic minerals, there's over 30 of them. All of them are here in mineable quantities, except I think one. Not just little mines, big mineable quantities. Now, I'll give you an example. Zinc, common mineral used throughout the world. A lot of people don't know it, but 6% of the zinc concentrate in the world that's produced by mines every year, 6% comes from one mine in Alaska called Red Dog. That mine, the ore is so rich, the first body that they did was 18% zinc by weight. You could almost just pick it out of the ground and ship it to a smelter. But they didn't. They processed it to a certain point. The streams running through that area never held fish because the natural runoff just didn't allow for it. They couldn't live there. The water standards they have to meet, there's fish there now that were never there, okay? Because they got to meet a standard so high that they can live there. They built a port, a road, over $100 million spent of state money. All of it got paid back under state bonds. that were issued to help them do that. They don't run all year long because the ocean freezes there. You know, the port's frozen solid. They can't ship in certain times of the year. But they still produce 6% of all the world's zinc. Now, north of there, believe it or not, north of there, is the biggest graphene deposit ever found anywhere. It'll produce 50,000 metric tons a year at a minimum. And that will provide all the graphite and graphene anticipated the U.S. would need to use if we converted to a battery economy or an electric economy, as an example, assuming that's the technology that eventually is used. Cobalt, copper, zinc, molybdenum, all the rare earths are available in mineable quantities here, and there's a number of mines being developed that are in all different states of development. And I stay involved in that at a pretty deep level, in oil and gas and minerals, knowing what's happening here. And I subscribe to a couple of journals. They're pretty pricey because they only have like 400 circulation because they're for mainly people in the industry, but I want to be informed. And it reports on everything in Alaska and northwestern Canada, so I know kind of my region, what's happening here, what's coming. And already what's coming is huge. There's one project, Donlin Creek. It'll happen, and it's a native-owned land, so the natives are going to benefit greatly. In fact, Red Dog, the native corporations get 25% of the net. And then because of the way the Native Land Claims Settlement Act was written that my dad wrote, 70% of that doesn't go to the one native group that has it there. 70% of that money from natural resources is spread amongst all of them, because some were endowed with great resources and other native structures in Alaska won't. So the way they balanced it is the local group got to keep 30%, but the rest is distributed among the regional corporations and the village corporations under sections of the Native Land Claims Settlement Act. Again, a way to create wealth and equity and a way to build wealth. This initial settlement that my dad got, all the industrialists and globalists wanted to settle for 20 million acres. And my dad went all over the place. He went to every village he could get into and told them, don't settle for less than 40. And then he got 44 million acres instead, and almost $1 billion in cash, which in 1971 and 72, that was a lot of money. Now think about that. He's a freshman congressman. There's only one for this whole state. He had to convince 434 of his colleagues, enough of them to vote for the biggest land claim settlement in the history of the United States. And he did it in his first year, along with a bunch of the other legislation I'd mentioned earlier. And he was effective and he was efficient. Well, he could outwork anyone because he could do what I'm doing, only he could do it probably longer. And just on Russia, he could do this for a couple of days. But he was very bright on all of that. He knew how to work with systems, but more importantly, he came from roots that were real. So he identified with everyone he met. They weren't just people suffering, they were people he knew were suffering because he'd suffered right like that himself. Not as cruelly as some of rural Alaska at the time because it was bad. I mean, tuberculosis was running rampant here then. I mean, come on, most of it was fixed everywhere else. You know, people were dying all over the place here. And what was it from, ultimately? And what is it from today? It's post-traumatic stress syndrome from interacting with a culture that never understood them. The Russians came here first, enslaved everybody, made them do this work or die, or their families die. They enslaved them, they treated them like animals. Anytime they moved inland, they burned their fort to the ground and sent their canoes back with their heads in them. You know, they didn't take a lot of this territory that they claimed because they never got a fort built. In Southeast, they burned them periodically. You know, but the Russians had tried to make a land, they'd been all the way to California establishing trading facilities. You know, they were all up and down the West Coast. They just couldn't hold it because the natives here wouldn't let them. They got the chain, the Aleutian chain, because of the way it was set up. But once they got in interior Alaska, it was a whole different ballgame here. And the Athabascan people and the others didn't let it happen too far, but eventually they were just overwhelmed. I mean, when the gold rush happened, it was all over. By then it was all over. Too many people, too much change. But with it came every kind of disease you can imagine. You know, the Spanish flu was 100 years ago. The worst place in the world for Spanish flu was Alaska. The village I worked in, Chickaloon Village, was 250 people at the beginning of the Spanish flu, and at the end of it, there were 5 sisters living. that they grew back out of, another couple hundred, almost 300 probably now. But what happened was destruction. Tyonik, the other village that I'm affiliated with through adoption, how did that village form? Well, Chief Chickalushan, how would you feel at 5? Some stranger just jerking you out of everything you knew. How would you feel as a parent? Parents were hiding their kids. Can you think about that and then know that this isn't a past generation, hundreds of years ago? These are my friends right now. And when you look around and you see the impact in Alaska of what's happened for the clash of cultures, you don't have to look very hard to see it. And to see the impact of it, you just have to drive around my town for a few minutes. And Anchorage, I'm embarrassed about Anchorage. I should be proud of the city and what it did, but I'm not anymore. I'm ashamed of what Anchorage has become under the kind of leadership that thinks tolerance is a way to meet people and fix problems. Because it's not. It's meeting them right where they are, figuring out what happened, and then seeing what you can do about it. And what's happened largely in Alaska is all of our responsibility, and it's not someone dead from long ago, because I could complain about the Romans too, kicking in my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's door in Croatia. Or even more modern time, I could complain about the Serbs that butchered my cousin in the 90s on her front porch in Croatia. But I never even got to meet her. They live in the same place that my grandfather left over 114 years ago. I never got to meet her. I met family there that I didn't know I had, that live more free than most of us do, but they live poor. The household income there is $175 a month, but they live rich. They live in a rural place. They farm. They grow most of what they need, what little bit of hard cash they need. It's a lot like rural Alaska. A little bit of hard cash for the fuel to get to the meat, little fuel to keep the heat on in the winter. But other than that, it's really about what can you do on your own. And most of the world still lives this way. We've lost that in the West. We've become very dependent on everything else, which makes us weak in a lot of ways. Our independence is what always made us strong. And we've accepted an exchange. And I hope we get deep enough into this, and we will before we're done, because there's a way to reclaim a lot of this. What was different in Alaska was everybody here had the idea that we were going to build something. Let me tell you how my dad sat in the Senate, and I'm sorry for getting a little bit emotional, but I can't help it. It's just too important to just take lightly. You just can't do it. But my dad sat in the state Senate in Alaska in the early 60s, right after statehood. In front of him was a guy named C.R. Lewis, and C.R. Lewis was a John Bircher. For those who don't remember what John Birchers were, they were like the ultra-right of the day. And then on his other side was a guy named Tom Fink, who was Mr. Republican of the day. And then there was my dad, Mr. Democrat of the day, and in those days it was all about labor. And these guys on the floor of the Senate would fight like crazy, and then they'd all go to dinner at night, and they would continue the debate, and they cared about each other, and outside of that place they were always friends, because they were always fighting over a solution to make Alaska better. You know, and that's the way I grew up. I was always looking for the passion. You know, if I knew there was a lot of passion and it was about fixing something, I would get excited, because I thought that's all you needed, because that's what I saw. That's what worked. You didn't have to agree with the guy. You just had to know he had the same passion for a solution as you do, and you could go shape one with him. And that's the way we got things done in Alaska, because we could have this vigorous debate, but at the end we had to agree on something that was going to work, and not somebody from out of town telling them what they wanted for some other reason. We had to live here and make this work here, because there was no road out of town. One road out of town, literally. We get one slide just a little past here, and Steve running the camera, he can tell you where it is. Right when you drop down to Moose Creek. The next big earthquake, poof, no road for however long it takes to clear it. And a whole bunch of spaces like that all the way down the highway. The only other way in and out is by airplane. And when there's an earthquake, a big one, airports don't look so good to land on. And then you got ports, of course. And we've lost a few of those in our history too. The point of the matter is, this is a major part of the nation that's being ignored. It represents the biggest wealth in the nation. Just in oil and gas alone, we could pay the national debt. And hydrocarbons aren't going to be around forever. They're going to go away. We're going to get into that before this thing is over. Statehood and land. So they told us we were going to get 90% of all the rents and royalties, and hell, they decided to open up a little of the National Naval Petroleum Reserve. Now, when did we know it was a petroleum reserve? When we discovered oil leaking up on the surface of the ground and forming asphalt, more or less, for however many thousands of years that had been going on. So we thought, wow, this looks like a naval petroleum reserve, and that was way back before statehood. So we knew we were going to get it, and we knew sooner or later they were going to develop it, and we were going to get 90% of it, and the same with Anwar and every other area. And then we found out that the Statehood Act was as worthless as an 1880s Native American treaty. Right, because we went to the U.S. Supreme Court and argued this, and we lost, because the U.S. Supreme Court said a Statehood Act can be changed arbitrarily by any future Congress. Whoa. In other words, they could do a deal on us anytime they wanted. Now here's the sad part about it. As the state of Alaska and as a territorial citizen who was violated by this entire Statehood Act. And here's why. Under a treaty in the United States Constitution, a treaty supersedes the Congress. That's why they require so much to get done, because they are like supersedes everything. So when you make treaties, they're supposed to bind like nothing else. But we broke them all with the tribes over time. But then we quit doing those because they kind of come back to bite you. The Hawaiians had theirs revisited and did a little better deal over there. But when we look at what happened here, we didn't have a settlement. So they discover oil. You can't build a pipeline unless you know who owns the land under it, because bankers don't like financing things when you don't know the title's good. And they were talking about, at that time, the biggest private investment in history. And it was estimated to cost $1 billion, and they ran into a few cost overruns, and it cost $9 billion when they finished. Now, I mentioned I worked on that because it was a historic thing. I really wanted to be there. And as I think back on it, it was a cost-plus job. The more they spent, the more the companies made. What do you think happened? Well, it didn't cost $1 billion. You know, when you get 10% over cost, you're only going to get $100 million on that. Why not get $900 million instead? And that's what they did. So that was cool for them and bad for you and me, because that set the tariffs, the transportation cost of that oil. And then the oil companies own the corridor too. They own the pipeline. So they were getting the tariffs, and they're getting the oil, they're getting the gas, and Alaska got 12% of the whole thing, 12% in royalty, plus almost $948 million on the leases when they first leased them back in 1969, and they started flowing June 17th, 1977 is when the oil started actually flowing. I know because I left May 31st of that same year as I finished my last job on that project. 2 million barrels a day went through there. Now what happened in all this is we had a couple of really interesting governors, both of them Republican governors. Wally Hickel was one. He came a couple of different times, and he believed in the owner state, and he owned a bunch of hotels and property here, and he showed up with no money years ago in the 50s and made something of himself, and became governor a couple times. He always had big ideas, real creative guy. He used to make people nervous, you know, because he was like too creative for politicians. But I liked Wally Hickel because he always had a big vision for Alaska, and he believed we should be the owner state. that we owned all these resources he called the commons, our oil and gas, our other things. And I shared that vision as I see it with him, is we're in the unique position. And so Governor Hammond, incredible visionary Republican governor, decided that a good idea would be to put 25% of all the money we were making from oil and gas into a fund that wouldn't be touched, would be built up like a big savings account. The only mistake is we should have put it all in, because if we had by now, we would be, all of our government costs would be paid out of that fund. It would cover the whole thing. But we got 25% in. Now what do we do with that? We gave everyone a vested interest in that in Alaska, because about the same time we wiped out the income tax. We didn't have a state property tax. We never had a state sales tax. So in Alaska, we have some local property taxes, and we have some local sales taxes in certain communities. And then we have federal taxes, but state, no, not for the average person here. You're not being taxed, because our tax is paid out of our commons, out of the things we own in common that we get rents and royalties from, except for the part the federal government screwed us out of. And that's just the UN treaty, which was a treaty that superseded that Constitution. Had we just made a treaty arrangement, we would have been better off. But we even were given bonuses. $5 bonus, doesn't seem like much money. But when you were only making $100 or $85 a month back then in the military in Anchorage, $5 was worth going to the poll. Now, why would the occupying force have a vote in anything here? And they did. There were 20,000 military posted here. They voted. A lot of people in villages didn't read or write English at that time. They didn't. Okay? Who decided statehood? Here. And no one had the option of not doing it. They were bringing Hawaii and Alaska in at the same time, because Hawaii at the time was Republican, Alaska at the time was Democratic, and it wouldn't change the balance in the U.S. Senate. That was the theory. So they brought them both in at once. That's why 49 and 50 happened at basically the same time, because it was about balance in the Senate. Now they're talking about D.C. and Puerto Rico and other places for political reasons that aren't balanced, but this was the nature of things in the 50s. You did it differently. There was a little bit more honor and a little less tribalism in government. And that's really what I want to emphasize here too in Alaska. As different as we all were, we were building a state. We're still building a nation, folks. We're just further along, but we're not doing it. We're not participating in the way we are. We've been moved out of it to a great degree. I had mentioned government by endowment, because Norway did this with their oil fields. They have, I think, $500 billion in their permanent fund, enough to take care of their old people, to take care of education, to take care of a lot of things, because their natural resources have been converted to produce revenue streams that relieve the burden. These are one-time sources of revenue. When these minerals and oil and gas are gone, they're gone. So to put them into a frame where they continue to produce revenue, to operate the functions, the true functions of government, would make sense that we do that we're smart about that. Alaska now has somewhere around $70 billion in our permanent fund, and this session of the legislature has spent nearly $20 billion in other funding that was various pockets of money, and they've exhausted our state's revenues. If it wasn't for the federal COVID money and the temporary rise in oil, we would be in deep trouble here. And we are. Our oil revenues are way down. Our tourism is in the toilet. The other industries are suffering by virtue of the fact that everything is disrupted in supply chain. And that's grossly unfortunate because Alaska is in fact a great hope for this nation as a protein producer with our oceans. The potential of agriculture here as weather and climate changes, because it's going to continue. It's not going to be stopped no matter how much you wish it would. It's not. It's going to change. We should be building for that change. You know, the Japanese have been doing it for 3 decades. They've been buying agricultural rights in Canada because they've lost the ability at the right elevations, the right temperature gradients to grow crops in the manner in which they wish to. So they started decades ago because it's obvious what's happening. So you can scream about it, or you can accept the fact that some of it you're not going to stop. You're going to have to adjust the way you work. Here in Alaska, we've developed some things. I talked about the mental health trust. That was pre-statehood. Now I'm going to tell you how a trust is misfunctioning. This is one of them. And I spent enough time, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, but think about it, 1 million acres of land that you've had since the mid-50s. Okay, now 65 years. You'd think you'd have an inventory of that, know what it's worth. You know your trustees. They don't have a clue. I ask them for a balance sheet, they can't produce one. They can show you the cash portion that someone else is managing and all of that, but that's being managed by someone else. As trustees, they cannot give Alaskans a value for their own land that they hold in trust to solve the mental health problems of Alaska, which I can tell you are a dismal failure. I asked my conservative banker friend Dave Cuddy if I'd given you 1 million acres, including all the oil and gas and minerals and timber and everything that went with it, could you figure out how to make that work for mental health in Alaska? He started laughing. Of course, 65 years and that kind of a program to work with, this problem be solved. We haven't done anything. They don't even have an inventory of the assets. They say they're all for sale. I said, okay, where's the listing? Oh, they don't know. Now you're going to buy land in Alaska. You're sitting in Italy. You're a big industrialist. You think, man, I need about a 10,000 acre parcel. Wonder if any's for sale. Oh, let me call the Mental Health Trust in Alaska. They'll know. Give me a break. This isn't going to occur to anybody. You're going to call something that says real estate in the phone book. They don't have enough sense to get an inventory of what they have and make it for sale, although they say it's all for sale. And none of it's available. Here's how it's sold. You come in and you say, I'd like this piece of land. They go get the highest appraisal they can and say, that's the price. Okay, I guess that's one way to do it. But it's not a way to sell land, it's just a way to sell that piece of land. It's not a way to get more land into private hands so you can turn that into something else so you can deal with mental health. When you have your land for sale, either it is or it isn't, and you ought to find a way to do it. Bureaucrats don't really like that. They like to kind of maintain the program, not have anything controversial. No, don't rock the boat until at least we get through, 20 years and a gold watch, that'll do it. And that's what you're dealing with here. Real leadership looks at the assets. We'll talk about that asset later, because there were some ways that it could have been used to solve some big problems in Alaska. The University Trust, I don't need to explain, it's the same basic formula. They haven't made it work for them. They're always in deficit. The price of education keeps going up, and they don't recognize that in a place where no one can get anywhere, maybe we need to use the internet to educate people in Alaska. Wouldn't that be neat? We have the best telemedicine system in the world. We have T1 lines that can carry huge data feeds into every native village in Alaska to handle the medical care, and they got enough excess capacity to run an entire educational program in every village of this state with just a hookup. We're not even thinking about solutions because of a lack of leadership, because virtually all legislation is driven by lobbyists, not holistic thinking of a plan. That's why you should insist on people that want to lead in government. They actually have a plan that's not a slogan, that takes some time to articulate, because to have a plan, it takes time to explain a plan. And what we've been doing all day today is started that plan with you, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And now we're going to work our way through the commons of Alaska and then through the commons of our country and maybe see a different vision for ourselves. I talked about telemedicine and rural health. Care of this, because Senator Stevens at the time, the senator my brother Mark beat when he ran for the U.S. Senate, but at the time, he said no, and he was a powerful man. He said, no, sorry, American Dental Association, we're going to allow people to fill cavities without a dental license. We're going to do it with 2-year degrees. We're going to teach people how to clean teeth and how to fill fillings and do basic dental work with 2 years and 3-year degrees, not dental degrees, and not your stamp of approval. And so they worked really hard. They got every university in America not to teach one of them. Not one. So we sent them all to New Zealand where they had the same program, and we made sure they got taught, because the native leaders of this state said, oh, you're not going to do this to us. And Ted Stevens said to them, you're not going to do that to them. And guess what? We have dental technicians all over Alaska doing the dental care that the American Dental Association stood in the way of for their own selfish interests as people died in our villages. And the American Medical Association does the same thing. They won't let you stratify medical care in the way that it ought to be stratified so that you can do more with lower level techs of lower level skill levels. Why aren't we doing more of that instead of less of that? We're protecting a class of power, not people, power, an industry that wants to stay, wants to keep, and wants to grow. Can you blame them? That's what they do. But they want to do it on the backs of our civil liberties and our freedoms and claim them as at their corporate property. Now, what happened in Germany was alliances between corporations and government. They called that fascism. I don't know what you call our version of that, but it's corporations and government and cooperation. We just don't like to associate it with that word fascism. So what do we call it here? I don't know. I call it corruption. Corporate corruption is what I call it. Other people call it fairness doctrine for the corporations. After all, they're people too. No, they're not. You have a finite life. Corporations live forever as long as you pay the fees. They don't die of old age. They don't breathe air. They shouldn't decide anything for someone that does, right? Unless they're equally liable and accountable, which means their boards and their officers get to go to jail when they screw up. When they create some disaster like Bhopal and kill 1,000 people. Who went to jail for that? Nobody. Mass murder, corporate excuse. Sorry, general liability insurance will cover it. That's where we're at, folks. Corporate liability insurance, tort reform. Let's save the corporations because after all, they run the government now. Want to keep the government going. Does that sound right? Not to me. But that's where we've gotten. Now let's think about rural health again. Remember when I talked about them netting all those rivers? Blocking all those fish? A lot of them never came back. Then there were other reasons they did things. They diverted streams. We rehabilitated one in Chickaloon Village, put a stream back where it belonged, returned 26 miles of salmon spawning area, and introduced a technology that was brand new, but it really wasn't. It was micro hatcheries. And these are like small, they're the size of a Pepsi machine or a big refrigerator. And they can produce 600,000 eggs every year in about 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And this was not new. This was really old. This is Southeast Alaska Tlingit technology. The way the Tlingits did this, because they had very steep mountains, they had very short river lengths, very short spawning areas. So you didn't have much area. So they would collect up the eggs from the mating species, and they'd put them in baskets that had little holes. They were like loose baskets. And then what would happen is they'd put them by the waterfalls where the mist would keep them all moist. And then as the eggs formed, and then the fish formed within the egg, and the little fry hatched out of the egg, they drop through the hole of the basket and fall into the water. Well, why is that important? Well, the scavenger fish, like the trout and other species, they eat all those eggs when they get laid in those egg beds. And about 85% of them get eaten before any little fish pop out. So this assures more little fish will pop out, and less will get eaten, and more will escape, and more will come back. And it worked. So the same idea was put into this Pepsi machine was keep the water the same temperature, all right? Mist the eggs to keep them moist. Get them away from the predators into trays that you could look into, and then twice a day they check the temperature of the stream to match the temperature in this big machine. And then they're cleaning and filtering the water, and then anything gets infected or diseased, they can see it, and they can get rid of those diseased eggs and keep everything clean. And then when the eye forms, when they're just about to hatch, they take them with a Venturi system in a backpack, and they literally put them into the beds deep enough, so they're deep enough where the scavenger fish can't get to them, and they plant the eggs in the bed. So instead of holding these eggs all year long and hatching fish and then trying to feed them and keep them alive, which is where all the diseases and the problems happen, now they have the genetic species from that stream being matched to that stream, being put back in that stream, and during the process of the egg growing, if they oscillate the temperature in just the right way, the bone inside the gill will create a barcode so they know which ones grew in that environment and which ones were natural. So when they come back, they can decide who was natural and who wasn't. They don't have to put tags and artificial stuff in. It's just about a little bit of temperature control to give you that little difference in bone formation. So applying the best of technology and the best of knowledge and shortening it up to a 6 to 8 week period, depending on the species, they're able to get them back in, and 85% of the eggs come out instead of 15% naturally. So there you get an increase. Now, I took the lieutenant governor under Republican administration down to take a look at Chickaloon when he was a lieutenant governor, and we went down and looked things over for like 4 or 5 hours. I took them all over, a tour through their whole program. And then he attempted to get this funded so we could pilot this in a number of places. They piloted outside of the state in Nome, the only place fish came back that year, in Chickaloon, and then the one place in Southeast. These micro hatcheries are now being used throughout the West Coast as they re-permit the rivers and hydroelectric projects, being repurposed all over because they're very efficient. One of my friends who's in the legislature here in Juneau, I forgot I even mentioned it to him, and he called me the other night and said, "Hey, that bill's moving." And I said, "What bill?" And he goes, "On the fish hatcheries." And I went, "Oh yeah, I forgot I even talked to you about it." Because no one's paying me for this stuff. It's just a good idea. It had its time. I got hold of the guy who invented it. I said, "Hey man, what happened? Why didn't you get anything?" And his legislator got unelected. So I talked to my friends. This is a good bill. It's moving. It's going to happen. They could do this on every major river system in Alaska, all 300 of them, and bring a fish stocks back by coordinating the biology with the state, training each community to do it right, and then allowing them to grow their own fish, grow their own food. That's agriculture in Alaska. USDA, we had to get them to modify the Farm Bill, something else I worked on. We got to get them to modify legislation because they're dealing with 400 years of agriculture in the lower 48. It's not that here. It's about fish, it's about moose, it's about a different kind of agriculture that fits where we are and can do something different and can bring the food stocks up. Instead of fighting over the last fish, is what my chief used to say, how about making more fish? I think that's a great idea. One of the ideas I had 20 years ago, I just ran into the guy whose radio show it came out on, and it was on buying up the commercial permits when they become available and reallocating to subsistence users and to sports fishermen. Because right now they only get 3%. They're starving still in villages because they get 3%. All the rest goes to commercial fleets, mostly who are out of state, out of Alaska, that don't have a vested interest here. Every time a permit is foreclosed by the IRS, the state ought to buy it up and reallocate it to private users. Then you rebalance the deck. We can do that. Every time they become available, don't let them be sold out of state anymore. Make them be sold here. Buy them back. Take the supply and demand factor out. These commercial boats, a lot of them are losing their butts. There's too many of them out there. If you do that, they will make money. There will be more fish. It's a supply and demand question. Again, allocation. Now I see in the paper 20 years later something's moving in that direction. Because when I did that radio show, the head of the Commercial Fishermen's Association at the time in that area calls up on the radio show, "That's a great idea. Why aren't we doing it?" I said, "Don't ask me. You're the fisherman." Well, it is happening now. It's 20 years later. Plant some seeds. Never know who hears what. And this is what all this is about today, is talking about ideas that work. A reallocation of the resources. Don't fight over a little bit. Back, this next section is the tribal world, which, as I said earlier, is sort of where my passion is when I think about government, working within government. And here's what I always used to hear whenever I'd go into virtually anywhere in the native world was, "I'm gonna fight for my village." I mean, I don't know how many times I heard that, which I loved hearing because it tells me there was passion there. But then what my job was to change fight time. I'm going to build my village. And this was a very different thing, you see, because within the village, all that passion, remember, this is families that have been together for generations that care about what's going on in their community. They really do. And the amount of passion that gets released, as long as it's not about somebody being abusive or somebody stealing or something like this, if it's about how to make it better, man, that's all I ever wanted, was when I can find that much passion, I know what I can do with it. I can turn that into their dream, whatever that is. If they have that much passion, that's the magic. You see, what I was explaining in the early portions of this is thoughts with emotion and intent. That's how you create reality. Now, when you get that level of emotional intent and thought, that's powerful. That's why being close to the earth, being close to each other, being close in relationship is so powerful. And why the isolation that we have in the world right now, the separation that we have in the world, that's being emphasized actually under the guise of cooperation. They've actually created increased division. Think about how it's playing out. It's increased division. Why is that? Remember when I was talking about beliefs many hours ago, and I was using the example of the woman in Saudi Arabia dressed in black, but feeling very happy and good about herself, and the woman on the beach in France without her top on, feeling perfectly fine, and the woman in Iowa just kind of wondering about both of them and just liking her house dress. And all of them were right according to beliefs. But beliefs all the time don't work out so good. Think about all those missionaries that believed these young savages, as they called them, needed a boarding school. Okay, they meant well, they didn't do well. That's always the case, it seems like, when you come into an area. And that was my paper I delivered for the Orthodox. And actually the invitation, the way that all rolled up, I want to tell a little bit about that story. As I was lecturing on HARP, and I'll cover more on that later, in the European Parliament, and then I was invited to a group called GLOBE, the 12th Assembly, and it was 200 legislators, 44 governments. I was presenting on HARP, another guy was presenting on the nuclear cores, and after my presentation ran about an hour, an elderly woman approached me and she says, "My name is Maria Beckett, and we trace our roots to the island of Patmos and the revelation of John, and I represent the Orthodox Church in Greece and Istanbul," she said to me, which is kind of a big thing. And she says, "You've just delivered the apocalypse," and discussing some of the technologies I just covered. And I thought that was kind of an interesting way to see it, considering who she was and who she said she represented. And John, you know, the revelation of John is the book of Revelations in the Bible, by the way, for those that don't know that. And the Orthodox were with the Catholics up until 1054 AD when they split, and they took the eastern part of the world supposedly, and the Catholics took the rest. And you kind of know most of the rest of the story, but the Orthodox we sort of forgot about many parts of the world. But there's 5 patriarchs, and they're equals. And the first among equals comes from Constantinople, what is today Istanbul, and that's Bartholomew I, who's called the Green Patriarch, which is kind of interesting. And the reason is he's an environmentalist, which is kind of interesting. But the reason he is because of a verse in his book called Revelations 11:18, which says that God will destroy those that destroy the earth. That's what he says. And if you go back to the beginning of this conversation many hours ago, we talked about stewardship within the earth as part of the plan. And so doesn't that kind of make sense if you were a bad steward that, you know, you kind of screwed that up too in the garden of the earth? But we have all this potential within this garden that is the earth. And within that potential is the possibility of change. And so the tribal world is very close to the earth. They've depended on the earth for sustenance and for wealth and for happiness until other cultures arrived and started screwing it up. And they had their own classes of culture. You know, Alaska has 228 tribal governments, half the tribal governments in the country. Most people don't know that. There's like 12 major linguistic groups, and then there's dialects within those, dozens, in fact. It's such a big area. There's so, think about Europe, you know, and how many languages there are. Then you can think about Alaska, too, for big chunks of that. You know, so very diverse, very different value systems, very different ways of running governments. And they used to slave between each other. You want to talk about slavery in the Americas, it started with Native Americans. They used to enslave each other. They'd catch people and they'd make them work, you know, or they'd, you know, use them in other ways. But slavery was common among indigenous. That was what you did. They did the hard lifting, the ones you got from the other village. It's also the way you mix the gene pool, quite frankly, and you weren't inbreeding with your family all the time. It happened by raiding parties or trading parties. But somebody was having a party, you know, and that was what was going on. The new missionaries into the world were the environmentalists and the politicians and everyone else coming in. But the story I told to Globe and what I learned from them was enough. And they invited me then to a second conference. This one was on the Black Sea, and it was an environmental conference called Science, Religion, and the Environment. Right? Now that was an interesting one. For that one, I'll tell the short version of the story. I'll tell the long version some other day. But the short version of it is, I end up taking this trip and I go to Athens to meet everyone. And then in Athens, we get two 727s chartered to take us over to Trabzon, Turkey, to meet a Greek ship in a Turkish port. Anyone knows anything about modern politics knows that doesn't happen. How did that happen? Well, somebody that owns 7 or 8%, I think even it might have been as high as 9% now that I think about it, but it was 7 or 8% of the Turkish GMP, the gross national product, you know, the whole wealth of the nation was going through this guy's hands regularly. So they pretty much could let him do whatever, you know, and so he got the ship there. But a lot of people didn't like that idea, and a big protest showed up. They were the Grey Wolves, which were Turkish nationalists, and they liked to throw rocks at buses full of people like us, I guess, because the rocks were flying and the police were there, and they were trying to keep everyone away. They managed to do it pretty well, and they had 4 police cars with 4 cops in each one, 2 on each side of the bus, in the front and the back, and all the different buses that we were. There was a bunch of us, and so 450 of us end up on the ship, and we weren't taking any land cruises that day, so we hung out on the ship. But there were only 450 of us, and then 50 members of the international press that were invited. And the ship was set up for 2,000. There was a bigger crew than there were passengers. But it was all us, and it was a closed conference, and it included all 5 patriarchs from the Orthodox Church, representatives of the Pope, the Aga Khan from the Muslim faith, Nobel Prize winners in science, politics. I mean, everything you could win Nobel Prize winnings on, they were there. The big corporations, BlackRock, all the big ones were there. So we had representation from the Buddhists, Hindus, everybody. You know, I mean, it was this big mix. We had the head of the Union of Concerned Scientists on board, writers, authors like myself, others. And I thought I'm going to be there to talk about HARP. You know, they brought me all this way to do this thing. I get there and I'm not on the agenda. I'm a rapporteur in one of the sessions. I go, what am I doing here? And she says, I wanted you to, Maria Beckett again, she goes, I wanted you to meet people and they need to meet you. And that's why you're here. All right, now I'm on this ship for 12 days with all these people. I don't believe in something for nothing. So I spend the time learning by all the best minds in the entire region, anthropologists, archaeologists, economists, vice presidents of all the countries we're visiting. You know, there's 7 of them. I meet a lot of people. I learn a lot. I learn fast. When I got all done, I integrated into a paper I wrote called The Environment and Poverty. 6 months later, I get another invitation from the Patriarch, and they want me to attend a conference called The Environment and Poverty. I think, well, that's weird. I just wrote him a paper about that, you know, a few months before. So I asked the foreign minister of the Patriarch in Istanbul, I said, did you read my paper? I go, I really can't come as a participant. I can't afford to go there and spend that kind of time. I'm just too small of an operation. So he says, I didn't read it, but please send it to me again. I emailed it that night, and the next morning he calls me back and he says, Nick, would you consider coming as a keynote speaker? We'll cover it all. And I started laughing. Hey, I just said you could have the paper. I don't need to be there. And he goes, no, I want you to come and present this paper. And I go, what is the agenda? He goes, well, Robert Kennedy Jr. is going to be speaking. One of the commissioners from the European Commission is going to be speaking. People from UNESCO are coming. You know, the the head of the patriarchy in terms of this kind of stuff is going to be there. We got a lot going on. We really like you there. I said, okay, I'll go. I'll do it. And so I get there, and I'm on the agenda with the first Catholic bishop of Brazil, who turned out to be a really cool guy, and I mentioned him earlier. I met the executive director of the European Council of Churches, Rudiger, and he was really an interesting guy. And I met all these guys from different universities from around the world, and a bunch of smart people in business and politics. Again, it was the same mix: science, business, politics, religion. A weird mix all together in the same room, working through ideas. This was apparently the 5th and the final session to address this issue. They'd done 5 in a row. So when I arrived there, in those days my hair was a lot longer. I was doing a lot of indigenous work. My hair was down around my waist, and I used to always wear it back, and I didn't wear suits and ties. I really kind of loathed them back then. They figured if you're choking off that much oxygen for the brain, I could see what happened to so many people in government and so many people in business. I didn't want one of those choking me. So I'm there, and he says, look, I'd like you to be on the steering committee for this conference, and then I'd like you to consider being one of the chairmen of one of the 3 working groups that we're expecting to come out of that. And I went, oh, okay, I guess I'll do that. And then he goes, oh, and by the way, would you consider jointly handling the plenary session at the end with Rudiger here from the European Council of Churches? Now, what a plenary session is, for those that don't know, that's where you get business leaders and religious leaders and science leaders and political leaders all to agree on something that actually is meaningful. And hasn't been watered down and dissected to the point of being neutered into nothingness. So that was the challenge for them, but I didn't know that was the challenge for me. But I knew all of a sudden I had a lot of work to do, and I thought I was coming there just to present something. And then what was going to happen with that paper that I did have on third world development is it was going to go to 1,000 parishes all over the world where it might get some use. And what it basically said, and it was funny because UNESCO presented almost the same idea, and they said, UNESCO said, we've screwed this up all over the world for hundreds of years. We've gone in with the philosophy of imposition. We'll come in and show you how to do it, rather than a philosophy that says what's here that we can support and not disturb. Wow. After hundreds of years, centuries of abuse from the very institutions, in fact, involved in this event, the final and foundational thing was discovered. Meet people where they are, even then, right? All this stuff we've been talking about, it still gets back to that. Meet them where they are, not where you are, not where you want to be, or not where you think they need. Forget all that judgment. Meet them where they are and find out who they are based on what they might tell you and how they might inform you. Then you might know something. My family goes to villages all over this state and is still respected because we did it that way. We went into communities and said, my dad, oh man, it was obvious the suffering. He wanted to know who was in charge. And every village ran a little bit differently. Sometimes it was an elderly man or woman. Lots of times it was elderly women, I can tell you, in a lot of these villages, because they were matriarchies traditionally. That's how they operated. They were the ones who cared for people, and the men hunted and did the things that were needed to take care of things that were different. But the caring part of that village life and the natural structures of leadership, as my dad traveled around and tried to figure out what to do about it as a leader, what it came into was a different solution than reservations. Reservations had nothing but suffering too. He had seen that already. So this was a new model, a new attempt to transfer wealth in the hands of people. Now what I was doing in the villages was something different. Is I got asked by Chief Gary Harrison after he read that paper, he said, let's try that here. And it was basically a bottoms-up kind of thing. And part of that was applying Maslow's hierarchy of food, clothing, shelter, safety and security, belongingness, and self-actualization in that Maslow's hierarchy. And the thought was, and when I went to the council that very first day, when we met, that here was the setting. That morning's newspaper had just come out in that area the size of West Virginia. And the political cartoon was a big one. It was a big chunk of the page. And it had an Indian laying on the ground. Written on across the Indian was the name Chickaloon. And on the neck of the Indian was the foot of our local senator, Scott Ogan, at the time. Now I got to know Scott quite a lot later. Not a bad guy, and really regretted not meeting with us because it wasn't very many months when his effigy was being burned in the parking lot of a local elementary school with 1,200 people in attendance, which was way more than even lived in that part of our valley up there. It was like a lot of people. There hadn't been that many people screaming at government in the area since they formed the borough in the 60s. And they were really angry at him because he was listening to lobbyists and not talking to his constituents. He went through a lot of stress in his life at that time. He almost died of a heart attack, in fact. He was hospitalized, he got pretty ill. Eventually he was out of the legislature. I got to meet him in a different setting later, and his regret was not talking to us. And I think that's really was the problem, is people aren't, and that's the problem now. People aren't talking to each other. They're just making a lot of assumptions about what ought to happen or what not ought to happen, and no one's looking for the solutions. They're just looking at a way to blame everyone else and to be the latest group of victims who need the next thing to put salve on their wounds. We're all wounded. We've all been screwed over one way or another. Everyone's got a drama to tell if you want to listen long enough. But it's not the drama you lived, it's the life you live and the freedom that you live within it and how you build something out of a mess. And we're all in a mess. The tribal world is about that. I mean, what I did with Gary is I go out and I said, okay, what do we have to work with? And we looked at what was there, we looked at where the problems were. It's a long story of the rebuild. It's a separate story. We're going to tell that one day. In the next few days, Paul and I might even film it out there because there's a lot to see. And we're going to make that drive after we do this. Because what we did out there is show that you could create a government that functioned, that was a government. These are sovereign nations within the nation. A lot of people don't understand that about tribal governments. They actually have sovereignty. States don't. They lost it in the Civil War, actually. The way states are treated is very different because of the Civil War. The way tribes are treated as sovereigns is very different than states in a lot of ways. And yet subordinated in a lot of ways unfairly too. So tribal governments in Alaska are still lacking land settlements. I think there's room for a second land settlement in Alaska for the rightful governments. I mean, my dad did the best he could, but he did not settle with, he did not make a treaty. And there was not a vote or a consideration by everyone involved. There was the native federations, there was informal and formal groups, but you couldn't call them government. Those governments weren't recognized, most of them, until 1993, 22 years later under the Clinton administration, and Adair, who was Interior Secretary at the time. And what they did then is they recognized the tribal governments as valid domestic nations and gave them the recognition, but never settled anything with them. Those are the rightful governments, and they deserve a settlement too. And the federal government kept way too much land in Alaska, and 9% was not enough. Everyone listening to this feed should know this. The Native Americans of Alaska have not been settled with yet, and they deserve a settlement here. They deserve a fair one that gets them their government back. Because without land, how can you be a government in the right way? The corporations have their land. It was set up different. They're not like the Western, they're a weird hybrid. They're a social corporation almost. They're like an attempt to not have a reservation was made. And what Dad missed is what he would have fixed had he lived. I guarantee it, he would have fixed it. Perhaps it can still be fixed by another generation of Begiches someday. But the fact is it needs to be fixed because it's not done yet. It's undone. The governments were always there. We didn't recognize them until way late in the game, but it's not too late. And they have a right to litigate. Every tribe here recognized in 1993, they got a statute of limitation under the UN Charter that goes 50 years. They have a right to raise this issue because now they're recognized and they have not been settled with. And anyone hearing this that has any influence over international bodies, they need to recognize this obligation as a global one that needs to be resolved. And the United States needs to meet its obligations. It failed me as a territorial citizen because I didn't have the right, my family didn't have the right to say maybe we didn't want to be a part of this. I know a lot of people might be offended by that. I don't want to offend anyone. I just want to ask the question. If in 1958 you were given the option of being the richest country in the world per capita, maybe you would have made a different decision. But we didn't get all the information to make that decision, because I think Alaskans would have made a different one. And I think if military, the occupying force, hadn't been allowed to vote, it would have gone a different way. And no, we would have probably been allies, absolutely, to the United States, because the value systems, at least then, were similar. But this needs to be revisited because it is this generation. It's not 500 years ago. It's not before the United States was formed. It was after, when all of us were responsible. Now, what happened here when they came in here is, and they did this, the Treaty of Secession with Russia, what they said is Native Americans weren't citizens. If you were Russian and only spoke Russian, you had 3 years to return to Russia, or poof, you were an American. But if you were a Native American who was born here, you didn't have citizenship rights unless you renounced your religion and could read and write English, which my grandpa, when he became a citizen at the time. Listen, most of the white people here and most of the other people here, they couldn't do it. But that was the standard we put on the people that were here first. And in the South, they had, no dogs and no blacks. And in the North, they had no natives and no dogs going into places. But our civil rights issues got addressed early here. Our state legislature did it in the 1940s, started fixing this mess, long before the civil rights movement in the States. When my dad hit here, there were things going on here, way before there were things going on in the States. But we had a long way to go, and we still do, and it's not resolved. What my paper did is give me an opportunity to do some things, and I got to do it in Chicxulub Village, as I mentioned. I got to do some things in Tyonek that I mentioned. And I've got to do some things with other tribal organizations in Alaska and Native corporations in Alaska, and I'm proud of what they've done in many ways, and not as proud in others. But it's going to be the next generation and succeeding generations, because think about the trauma of this whole group of people and what happened here. It takes now one more generation. The children that are coming up now have a fighting chance. Have been hurt. Their parents have been hurt. They've been hurt by all of this. But there's a time now that we can heal a lot of this. The Native corporations are doing better. They're the biggest domestic corporations in Alaska now. When you look at the top 49, most of them are Native corporations. And they should be. They've done it. With 9% of the land, they've done it. They've made wealth happen here. What is wealth? We're going to get into it yet tonight. But they've done it because they've got land. They've got natural resources. They have labor. They have entrepreneurship. And now with the money, they have capital equipment, things that can make other things. These are the 4 factors of economic production. We're going to talk about them later. Money is the grease between. We're chasing the wrong thing. Real wealth are those things. We have our labor, but they're stealing it from us. We have entrepreneurship, but they're limiting that by making regulation impossible. Capital equipment is all about banking and equipment, things that make things. Capital is not money. It's shovels that make ditches and factories that make widgets. That's what they mean by capital in this instance. And then, of course, land and natural resources, the obvious, the real core of it. And that's the thing you got to remember is land and natural resources. When all of us were farmers in the 1800s, 84%, I believe, in 1830 were farmers. So that meant they owned land and natural resources. That means they owned tools and equipment that made things, capital equipment. That means they owned labor because they had to do this thing. And they were entrepreneurs because they had to make it all work and make money so they could survive. We had wealth. All of us had wealth. The vast majority of Americans have wealth. Now we have 401ks and little pieces of paper that represent someone else's wealth. Try and wipe your butt with a stock certificate. It won't do much for you. Ask them what happened in 1930 when that's all that they were worth, or starting a fire. Now, why is the stock market so inflated? We'll talk about that later. But paper is not wealth. It's a placeholder for wealth. something to remember. In Germany, before the war, they thought it was wealth until they were carrying wheelbarrows around to get a loaf of bread, of money. Wealth is the loaf of bread and what it took to make it, not the cash that took to buy it. And it's a key element when we talk about the tribal world, because there it's about survival and subsistence. You have to get your food, you have to process your food, and you have to eat your food. You have to make a place to live that's going to survive. In this part of the world, ladies and gentlemen, anyone who did it and did it past the age of 40 was respected. And you know, I never understood fully why elders were expected until I heard it from an elder in a presentation in Chickaloon Village. And it wasn't because they're old, and there's a lot of people in the native world that think because they're old, and in a lot of other cultures, because they're old, somehow they automatically get this wisdom keeper title. That isn't how it works. An elder in a community, in a traditional community as I've experienced it, aren't just a bunch of old people at all. They are the ones who survived, who went through trauma, as I was describing earlier, and survived in a way that caused them to thrive, to make it, to lift others. They're the leaders in the world of survival, those that know how to live a long life. And those are the ones people would listen to because they wanted to live too. In small communities where the rubber meets the road, you know what it takes to live, and you cooperate as human beings to do it. The further you get away from this, the more detached from the earth, the things that are truly valuable in wealth, the more of the illusion you buy into and the more dependence on every other system. This is why my dad believed that getting the economic wealth and the mineral wealth and the real wealth in the hands of the people, they would decide what to do with that wealth, whether the land would be developed or not, what would be developed or what wouldn't. And they would make it work within the context of their culture, but they would decide. What wasn't put in place was a traditional governance system. By allowing corporate boards, it meant a totally different approach that was alien. What should have been happening there is perhaps that structure, and parallel to it, a veto, the ability to preempt them based on traditional values on the traditional level. And that would have required recognition of tribes and settling with them, not corporations, and perhaps making a different structure. It's not too late. As I said, those weren't treaties, they're just laws, and they can be changed. Just like the Alaska Statehood Act. And what we need now is treaties with the tribes that are recognized, that deserve treaties, honor, and respect, and maybe a revisit of at least our Statehood Act that's been violated, because Americans should honor their word to the people that resided here, including me, before statehood. And we have a right to that, and it shouldn't be arbitrarily changed. And it has been for me as a white man, adopted twice in an Athabascan world, and you've screwed us all here. And you keep doing it by changing the rules. If you're going to change them back to the way they should be. You can't change it for the generations that are dead long ago, but this one is alive right now, and this isn't done yet. We're the last ones in. And it wasn't done right. You violated international treaties, and we have a right to be heard within our country, and if not there, in the international courts. But the tribes have to raise that issue, and it's their right to raise it, because you recognized them too late. But let's not do it with a fight. Let's not fight for our village on this one. Let's not fight. Let's find our path to the right solution that transfers from government back to people the wealth of the nation, because it belongs to us. When I think about Chickaloon Village and what happened here, and I miss so much of the Alaska story, we'll tell it again later, another day. But I want to talk about the kinds of things that can happen. With Chickaloon Village, they've made a lot of attempts to do a lot of different things with the land, and they've fought the corporation, they've been in litigation, they're fighting amongst themselves. It's inevitable that it happened that way. But a certain amount of land did get transferred into the tribal hands, and that got developed into assets that are producing revenue today. What we did there was we configured a team of people. We cross-trained everyone. We had to approach it totally different than Western management, had to reinvent the wheel a million different ways to find a way to tell people who had been told all their lives that they're losers that they weren't at all. In fact, they are the sterling example throughout this state of winners. Because what we talked about through the whole beginning of this is what we do there, what we did there. Help people see themselves again and their possibilities again within the context of culture, within the context of belonging, which the context of having food, clothing, and shelter addressed because you had a community that cared. I had one social service guy handle 1,100 cases in a year, and I never had one complaint. But I had a big percentage volunteer in our programs from time to time because we met people where they were. We went into the home when a disaster happened. We found out what was going on. We did the paperwork right there because it took a PhD to get it done otherwise. We didn't leave until the paperwork was done. Then somebody would get on the phone to me if it required an emergency decision because I had the authority to grant up to $500 for a fix. You know what that did a million different times? I mean, I'm exaggerating on the times, but every time it did make a difference between someone losing or keeping a job, getting a car fixed so they can get to work. Simple things. Getting a safety pair of boots so they can show up on the job and have a job. Simple things to get someone to work instead of waiting for the state, which waits until you're thrown out of your house and it's a $50,000 fix instead of a $500 pair of boots, and someone with the authority to make the decision. What we had is systems that met people where they were, and when we ran into obstacles, we fixed them. If it was a regulatory obstacle, we addressed it on the regulatory level. If it was strictly a syntax thing, we could deal with it. But whatever the problem was, we went for the solution. Now, my federal auditor that would come in every year and watch me take those regulations and stretch them right to the point of popping, but they didn't pop. They were followed and they were met, but they served that village and the purpose of those grants. And we didn't get $1 from the state because the state wanted us to waive our sovereign immunity as a nation, and we wouldn't do it. We said, keep your money. We never took it. No way will we do it. Now, I helped them negotiate their first private lending. Now, banks don't like you not being able to sue you. You know, when you're a government, you can't sue a legitimate government. You can sue the state of Alaska, but you can't sue for tribal government without their permission. You know, within tribal jurisdiction, you can't do it. It doesn't happen. And that's kind of interesting. So what do you do if you're a bank and they don't pay their payments? Well, we did it creatively. We weren't going to waive our sovereign immunity because that means they could access any of our assets. What we did instead is we said, on this piece of property that you're financing, we will not exercise our sovereign immunity on it, which tells them, A, we have sovereign immunity and we'll decide when we exercise it. Yes, we agree on that piece of land. They were taking the risk of the funding, and until their risk was gone, okay, we would do it, but only on that. And so that was a way for us to not to give up, not to have to say no, and for them to say yes, and no one lost anything in that. No one had to give up sovereignty to make it work. And the state is the same way. No one had to give up sovereignty to make it work. And they said it was fiscal responsibility. So what I said to them on one of those grants, I said, okay, we'll spend all the money the grant allows until we're done with it and we've performed every deliverable on this grant. And then you can come in and prove that we've met every requirement. We'll use our cash to do it. And at the end, you reimburse us. Or you tell us, sorry, you didn't make it. We'll take that risk. You have no risk at all. They wouldn't do it because they lied to us. And it was about waiving our sovereign immunity so they would get a pattern of us waiving it so they could say we don't have it someday. That's the government working with us. That was what was happening at the state. It's changed a lot. It's been a lot of years and a lot of, I won't say fights, I'll say a lot of learning that's had to take place, a lot of understanding that has to take place to know what's happened here. When people see that 75% of the homeless in Anchorage are Native, they think, oh, they're just a bunch of drunks. No, they're not. They're a bunch of suffering people that we screwed over. They were all jerked out of their homes. or their parents were, what would that do to you or me or any of us? It's the suffering we cause, and it's not from some past something, it's from what happened now. When I think about the third world and what's happening now we've got the new missionaries, we got the Chinese, we got the environmentalists, we got everybody telling them what to do. And you know what? I hope this time they don't listen to any of it. What we need is planning at the local level in a new way. I know some people working on that right now, preparing some initiatives to go statewide that are driven by Alaskan people. I think they're going to have a chance. I'm going to help them if I can. But that's the stuff I do as a volunteer. You know, I don't get paid for any of this, and I wouldn't want to. Even what's raised in this is to help Paula put a network together, a TV network, so others like me can be doing this all the time, that you can get good information. Leaving that and talking about the poor and the homeless situation in Anchorage, I put 400 hours into this over 2 years, a lot. And I put some of my own money in this, and Dave Cuddy, my banker friend, put up 10 grand and a bunch of time too. And we have an election in Anchorage a few days from now, on the 6th of April, my dad's birthday. I hope I get a birthday present and a new mayor that's going to clean up Anchorage and make it like a town should be. A town where people do care about each other and don't warehouse them in buildings to die sooner. I hope we change it, because what we had is a crisis of despair here. When you look around the country, that's what we have there too, for other reasons. It's not necessarily Native Americans in LA or Seattle, but it's despair. It's alcoholism, drug abuse, mental illness, primarily, about 80%, 85%. Go ask them, go look at any of it, that's what it'll tell you. Why are we doing this way? In Alaska especially, we're a wealthy place, we don't need to do this. We have the Mental Health Trust. What I suggested was a simple solution, and here's what it was. We don't tax anything here. I said tax alcohol 15%. What would that generate in Anchorage? $45 million a year. 15%. If you're spending $1,000 on alcohol a month, that's going to cost you $150. And if you're drinking $1,000 worth of alcohol, I need $150 from you, because you're doing a lot of damage in my community. Because half the violent crime, half of the rapes, half of the thefts, half of all the death from car wrecks and everything else is alcohol. And in Alaska, you pay 10 cents a drink, and it costs $2.25 a drink to subsidize them. I don't drink a lot of alcohol, one drink a year. I buy some every once in a while. I don't mind paying a little tax on it if I know I'm responsible for problems. The alcohol industry is an irresponsible industry that refuses to be responsible for the damage they've created in this country, or they would be supporting these tax initiatives everywhere in the country and taking responsibility instead of shifting the blame and allowing the death and destruction to continue. I think choices can be made by individuals, and when you make them, you pay your own bill. You know what it costs for a pack of cigarettes in Anchorage? It costs $10, $11 a pack. You know what it costs at the wholesale level? About 75%. The rest of that is taxes. Anchorage alone in the local share gets $20 million a year from cigarettes. They get from marijuana, last time I checked, about $4 million a year. And from alcohol, until recently, until I pushed on this hard, we were getting nothing. Zero. And no one was getting run over by a carton of cigarettes. No one was getting raped by a carton of cigarettes. No one was getting murdered by a carton of cigarettes. They were just murdering themselves. Hey, is that proportional? 21 million and nothing for alcoholism? What? That's every community, because alcohol is a powerful lobby that owns a lot of politicians. And they fought us on this. The first time I wanted them to get 15%, they didn't have what it took in leadership in this town to ask for it and dedicate it. I came back around a second time, you know, and this time they roll out 5%. And they got it in the middle of COVID, people willing to tax themselves in the middle. They didn't ask for the right amount because it's not enough to do the job. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we have 1,100 homeless people here, and up north of here, we have the Palmer Correctional Facility, empty. for a decade and a half. Everything there and the sheets, kept and maintained, heated and warm, 900 beds, reduced to 500 for corrections now because they need more comfortable quarters. How come 500 people didn't spend their time up there in the winter the last 15 years? It was empty. Not enough leadership to make it happen. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we have the Mental Health Trust throwing off $51 million a year in revenue, passing it around in little handouts, not having an inventory of what their assets are. And the only reason they have any money is because they got raped by the state once and they had to put money back to make up for it, and it's generating money now. Because the Mental Health Trust is a failure. A failure, 1 million acres, billions of dollars in resources, and they can't figure out how to handle a population of 700,000. That's the whole state, not the mentally ill. That's everybody who lives here. They have billions and billions in assets. They don't know how to even evaluate them and get them to work for them. Talk about a failure of leadership. You have the money, you have the revenue source, you have everything you need except enough leadership to put local and state and federal government together because they're too busy blaming you because you're a Republican, because this liberal city of ours won't work with the Republican people that are running the state because they don't want to give them any credit. Forget about you and I and the people dying here. It's some trust baby. That's who we had as mayor until he literally did pull his pants down in the mayor's office and get caught and went away in shame as a public servant in the mayor's restroom taking selfies for his girlfriend while his wife was at home. Made people mad in Anchorage. He went away. He can't even show his face here. But he ruined this town. And I bawled him out like I've never bawled out anyone in leadership because he ruined my town. This guy doesn't know what it is to suffer. He's a trust baby. He gets a check every month. His idea was, let's build hotels all over town, put homeless people in them. You remember the insane asylums of the 60s that had staff and we decided they were inhumane? Now they're talking about building facilities, putting people in them that are mentally ill and no staff. And then they say, oh no, we're going to staff them. But the same breath they say, but we can't because there's no employees with the skill set. And guess what? We have a state university that didn't produce enough, that know that we needed them 20 years ago. How come they're not producing the workforce we need? Because you got a bunch of academics busy producing academic papers. This is a state university. It started out as a community college network to educate people with a skill set to do work. We don't have enough plumbers. We don't have enough electricians. We don't have tradesmen. They make 6 figures up here when we have work. Real incomes and real jobs with real benefits. With your hands and your head, you can make a good living with a profession and a trade, and everyone should have both. And instead we have a watered down society that is washed out. Now why do people keep coming into Anchorage and making more camps? I'll tell you why, because when you have the services in Anchorage and you come from a village, living in a tent in Anchorage is a step up for too many people. And because it's accepted as okay in Anchorage to live this way, and it's worse in other places, you come into Anchorage and you think this is okay innocently. These are not people that are doing things purposefully to just violate everything. They get lost in this culture real quick. And there's predators in that mix, preying on them every day. There's not a woman in that group that isn't raped within the first week of being in that group. Raped. A friend of mine owns a business. He's finally able to get it sold, and they've ruined him. But every week he broke up a rape in front of his business in daylight. This should not happen. This is lawlessness. And this is wrong. And the excuses are, oh, we can't do this. We'll be racist if we arrest people. I'm not suggesting arrest people unless they're committing crimes, and I'm saying, yes, we do. I'm saying we need to start meeting people where they are. And if they're committing a crime and they're drug addicts or mentally ill, if that gets us a way to pull them out of that scene, then we should do it. People say, oh, that's inhumane. No, it isn't when a person can't think for themselves or they're violating the rights of everyone else. We have 100 miles of trails in Anchorage, paved trails, 100 miles. We can't use them safely anymore. I have to take out my city gun and put it in my belt when I walk to the park. And I pull my wilderness gun out when I go to the wilderness. Makes sense, you got bears out there. When I was a child of 8, I could walk in what are now the worst parts of this town where adults don't go during the daylight. That's wrong. We've let criminals take over our cities and we refuse to enforce our laws. We have to enforce laws or get rid of the laws. If we're not going to enforce them, why have them? You want anarchy? Go ahead. Or enforce the laws and meet people where they are and don't penalize them forever for failing. You know, people fail. They clean up their act. We need to find a way to clean up their record too so they can be productive again and not have a bunch of misdemeanors when they were failing. We forgive businesses for screwing all of us in bankruptcy. We forgive all kinds of things in our culture. Why can't we forgive a man who picks himself back up, a woman who picks up her life and puts it back together, and provide people found their own power in their own community again, and they're creating it in their own image as they should. That's sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen, creating a government in your own image. You're creating the image and likeness of God. How about creating your communities in the image and likeness of yourselves, each other? Not by outside influences, whether you live in LA or whether you live in Cactulic, you know, I mean, it doesn't matter where you live. Pick your place and find out what's good there. And if that's the place you want to be there. But don't go in thinking that you have something superior. Maybe you do in your world, but maybe not in theirs. And not to say one is more valuable than the other. Everything belongs within its context. I think that's fair enough to say. I love traveling the world. I love going into other cultures, and I'm very respectful when I'm there because I came there to be a part of that, and I respect that. I respect all altars in the sense of the people that decide are not me. Doesn't mean I worship at all altars, but I can be respectful. If we're going to be human beings that grow, we need to meet people where they are. The things of homelessness is going to be a whole different group of people. They're coming. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, and we're going to have to address things differently. And that takes me to the next portion, which is really about leadership. And I'm just going to say a few things because a lot of it I've said already. Leaders lift. When you think about leaders, we always think of pyramids with the leader at the top. It's like this. It is a pyramid, but the leader is at the bottom, lifting, holding up. The one you're not supposed to see, but you do. Leaders lift. This hierarchical structure is a press, and that's a different equation. So we need to flip this around. Leaders need to lift, not oppress. Kindness, respect, consideration, lifting, loving, those are the attributes of true leadership. Looking into people, seeing their potential, drawing it out of them. That's the attribute of true leadership. Do they know anything? Can they say it without a script? That's leadership, ladies and gentlemen, in every field, not just government. Do you really know it? Can you really say it? Could you explain it to a 5-year-old? And if you can't, you better be able to break down that language or go relearn it till you know it. Then you'll be creative again within your profession. You won't be a parrot in your profession. You'll be a creator within it. Or maybe you missed it. You missed your art altogether. It's never too late to change channels, reset your programming. But leadership, if they have no words of their own, they must have nothing to say. Think about it. How many speech writers do politicians have? How come they're not their own? Because they don't have anything to say. They make good faces. They look good on a 30-second spot or a 1-minute ad. They should listen deeply. They should look for understanding. They should try to understand their opposition well enough to see their own flaws and fix their legislation, or enough to be able to inform their adversary in that moment of where they're missing information. But that only happens if you respect each other. And in collective bargaining, when I was a union leader, one thing I was taught You have one spokesperson at each side of the table, number one. And the other is you set up a set of ground rules, the rules of how you're going to do this. That's the first thing you do when you bargain, is what are the rules. Then the next thing you do is you have to have trust. Because if anybody's lying at the bargaining table, that's when the bargaining ends for me. Because you got to trust the other guy. Now he can tell you, nope, I'm not going to answer that, or no, I'm not going to provide that. That's fine. But an overt lie ends it all. Because you got to trust the person you're negotiating with. You got to trust the people on the other side enough to know that you're dealing with an honest set of facts. If you don't have that, you don't have the basis of a democratic republic. You don't have the basis of anything that's going to get you to a solution. In my family, one of the ground rules was if you go to the thing with an argument, you better bring a solution. And the deal was you bring a solution in, then you're going to fight over solutions, you're going to get one at the end. Much better than a bitch session, which is what most people engage in, with a bunch of people sitting around complaining. So that isn't the answer. For Alaska, it was an opportunity of government by endowment. We still have it. I mean, we still have it with the resources that are here. If they continue to feed the permanent fund and build it, eventually there'll be a big enough fund that we'll never have to tax this population out of the wealth of the state. Why didn't we do that as a nation? Is it too late to do that as a nation? Maybe not. We still hold a lot of wealth in common. Let's not let it be looted by multinationals. Let's not let it be looted and squandered in the wrong way. As part of the Native Land Claims Settlement Act, one other thing happened. They had, my dad overrode, got the committee of Mo Udall, who was powerful at that time, overrode the committee, a freshman on a committee. That just doesn't happen. You got to get the majority of his own party basically to say, hey man, we're doing this. And he did. Unheard of for a freshman to get that big piece of legislation heard, but Udall had a plan, and when Dad was gone, he executed it, and it was about 105 million acres of parks and wilderness areas that got locked up subsequently. And they got locked up with the idea that locked up forever was the theory, but remember, none of this is a treaty. It can be changed by any legislator any time, and it will be. Because the groups that backed that were the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, a lot of industrial groups, and people went, man, that's so great. They're going green. They're supporting the environmental movement, locking up all this land. No, they weren't. What they were doing is make sure it was reserved for them, for multinational companies. And here's why. When you lock it up in parks and preserves, it takes it out of the BLM jurisdiction, which made it available to anyone over 18 that was an American citizen that could go out and stake mining claims. The areas they locked up were the richest in the state, absolutely rich. The Kantishna mining district, I was the last hard rock miner there in 1983, richest district, probably $1 trillion in resources in the Kantishna Hills, antimony, silver, gold, lead, zinc, a lot of stuff. Highly mineralized area. Where I was mining, the ore was 130 ounces of silver per ton, 1 to 10 ounces of gold per ton, and 15% lead by weight, and a trace of antimony, and which was used in batteries. And when you look at all that, that's a tremendous value per ton. We were flying it off the side of that mountain with a helicopter, loading it on 40-foot trucks and driving it 12 hours to Fairbanks to process it. And did it by hand, 26 days, 2 of us with picks and shovels. And then they shut that district down forever. That was the end of it. A shame, because the people mining on Quigley Ridge and the area that we were in and the whole region was fantastic. And it was a lifestyle. They were families living out there that would work for a month or 2 in the summer, take care of their family for the winter in one of the urban centers of Alaska. And it was a lifestyle that got taken as well from so many. And I was sort of there for the end of it. It's kind of the end of a lot of things in Alaska. But all those parks and preserved hold all of them in. And one day, those will be exploited under national emergency. You watch. But it won't be you and me invited in because we won't be able to respond to a national emergency. Only the multinationals will. You'll see it happen. Where it got reserved is the Native Americans on the Native Land Claims Settlement Act. That was before the state had even finished picking their lands. They got first pick. They got to pick first. And they did a good job, made sure they got some good mineral wealth, some good oil and gas based on their traditional boundaries, and they're going to do fine. Those that choose to develop their resources will do fine, and we'll all be the beneficiaries of it. But we need to move some more land out of government hands, at least the federal government hands, move it back into tribal government hands and into the state of Alaska's hands, because we got screwed on statehood. If they're not going to give us 90%, we need to redo this deal somehow. We need to reorganize it somehow, because it's just flatly unreasonable and unfair to have a statehood act that's not going to be honored. Going back to American government, which is where we're going next, I'm going to go quick because I'm not going to re-describe a lot of it. I've talked about the domestic nations of tribal governments. When we really thought about the U.S. government, I don't need to say a lot about it, was really about minimal government, self-determination, and not having a big complex thing where we had maximum freedom. And I've talked a lot about it because we're going to talk about the three branches when we get to the judicial. We're going to go quick through that because everybody knows most of it. I'm going to talk the dysfunction because I'm not going to talk about what you already know. But by the people, of the people, for the people, I think we can safely say it's not that way anymore. It's more about corporations. Legislation is not written generally by legislators, although there are a few that are competent in that area. Most of it's brought in. It's canned. A lobbyist shows up, the law is written. Here, Mr. Legislator, this is what I want you to sponsor and pass. They look it over, there's not usually much changes, it rolls into the system. You, Mr. Citizen or Mrs. Citizen, show up and they go, have a nice day, let's get a photograph, snap, snap, pat, pat, go your way. You want to have lunch with the congressman? Oh, that isn't going to happen. But I can tell you how to speed it up. Write out a $5,000 campaign contribution, then ask for lunch. I guarantee you'll get a lunch somewhere in his calendar. Now, what is that? Is that a bribe or is that a contribution? Now let's think about words again. Remember that apple? Apple pie, apple tree, apple. What do they mean? What do words mean? Okay, this is one I want to give you. Contribution equals bribe, because here's why. A bribe gets you access to the politician, it gets you influence on the politician, and it gets you an outcome from the politician. What does a contribution get you? The same three things. Nothing different, nothing new added. But you feel better about it because you got a set of regulations and you have a committee overseeing it, and after all, it's only a contribution. See, what a word does in effect is what it is in effect. You know, you could call a person a cat, but it doesn't make them a cat. They're still a person. So here we are again, giving bribery a new name so we all feel good about it in the West. How does it play out in Alaska? Somebody shows up and they're here to give us information about candidates, so they spend $5 million informing us about someone they don't like. But they don't live here. And it's not their congressman or their U.S. senator. But they want every Alaskan to know why they don't like them, so we can decide how come we shouldn't like them too. What? This is how it plays, ladies and gentlemen. It's about money and influence and power, and we give it nice names, but it's about effect. Do you feel free? No. Do you feel liberal and liberated in your life? No. And do you feel happy? Not most of the time, I would bet, in most cases. What we had before, when we left Europe, we had kings and sovereigns that kept us poor, and we were serfs, mostly, slaves, in a different form, but nonetheless, we didn't own anything. We couldn't own land. That's why land was so important when we showed up here, and that the government owning all of it wasn't the idea we had in mind when we all showed up here and started taking little bits of land and doing something with it. It wasn't for the king or the new kings. It was for us. The religious orders kept you dumb. See, the consciousness of who you are. Really, they did. And if you didn't agree, they just burned you alive in the name of love, right? Or they did something else more horrible to you. And they did all that in the name of God too. I'm sorry. I'm not interested in that one, not that God anyway, that does that through their human beings. Nope, I don't think so. This government was formed to do something different. Why did Thomas Jefferson never name his own religion but want to make sure all of us had freedom there? Because he wasn't going to shove anything down your throat or up any other orifices. He wanted you to decide your own destiny. He wanted you to have a sense of who you were as an individual, because you were the sovereign. The individual sovereign soul, not a king. Nothing's changed. The words have a bit, how we explain things a bit. A lot of people now can't even read Jefferson's words because they're too complex, and our average citizen doesn't have the vocabulary. That's a sad day in American history. Why do we have representative government? Why do we elect certain people? It's because they take on all the information so we can keep working, take care of our families, and run our farms and our businesses and do the things we do. And we're supposed to trust them to do it right. And they've violated our trust in every possible way. A lot of it incrementally, slowly, bite by bite, bit by bit, but it's time to reclaim it. The executive, look at that mess, look at the last two candidates. I've said enough about them. The parties aren't breaking the ties, but listen about ties. When the oil pipeline that happened in Alaska, it was a tie in the U.S. Senate, a tie vote. I was there as a kid. And you know who broke that tie? Agnew, before he went to prison. He broke the tie because the Vice President of the United States is the tiebreaker in the Senate. That's why having 50-50 in the Senate, whoever the executive is, they run the show. By getting rid of the filibuster, you get rid of the honor of the minority party, and they're about to do that. That's a mistake. That sets both parties as adversaries and enemies for the long haul, not at a time when we need cooperation. But we're being set up for this by the parties themselves. The legislative branch is the lowest it's been in popularity. 8% can trust it, the rest don't. So it's failed us. Now, what a lot of people don't know is they think congressmen are really well paid. They make around 160 grand a year. It's a lot of money in some places. Try and live on that in Washington, D.C. with a family. It ain't going to happen. You can't. If you got it more than you, you're not going to do it there. Or in the suburbs there, it's too expensive. And then you still have to have a home wherever you came from, because you came from somewhere. You got a home at your home state and there. And you know how many congressmen are living in their offices because they can't keep two residences? You don't really want to know the answer to that. Out of 435, I've heard the numbers around 100. Now stop and think about that as an American. Our congressmen who are running our government can't afford to have a house unless they're rich already in D.C. and in their home district. They can't do it. They got to live in their office, and their family stays in their home district, in their home, and that's how they run their family so they can run our government. And you know, go to Congress when they open the doors again and look at the average age of the staff. They're all under 30. Do you know why? Because they don't make any money. You have to be a roommate in a room with two other people to afford to live in D.C. and work in a congressional office. So there's no old talent. They're all under 30 for the most part. Half of them trust babies who don't have any connection. They just want a resume line item. And another group that need a resume line item but aren't staying long, but are really brilliant young people. But no continuity of experience in the Congress. This is a problem. This is part of the problem. We're going to take a break here in a minute. I want to get back into the U.S. We're going to blow through the rest of this. We're getting closer. But I want to talk about the dysfunction, some ways to fix it. When we get back, we're going to jump into this. We're going to blow through the federal pretty quickly because we see that already in play. And then we get into some international issues, some quick things on the economy, and then we're going to be wrapping up. We've got probably a couple hours to go, but then we're going to be done. Thanks for being here. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Hang in there. And remember, it's on a YouTube feed. You can always catch the rest and see it again, because if we go too fast, that gives you the ability to go quarter speed, half speed, 3/4 speed, full speed, double time, because that's what YouTube gives you. We'll be right back.